He was an artist chasing his dreams, and along the way, he connected with a kindred spirit.
My mom met Michael at work and fell in love.
They had like this kind of like glow, sparkle kind of romance.
But their passionate love story was cut short one fateful night.
You've been shot in the head?
She and her boyfriend had been shot and needed assistance immediately.
While two victims cling to life, detectives must unravel what went wrong.
Was this a robbery gone wrong, or was this an execution?
Someone had been stalking her and peeking through our windows.
And when a possible third victim emerges, the investigation goes into overdrive.
I remember asking, where's my sister? Where's Star?
She didn't answer the phone for none of us. She didn't call back or anything. Something had up.
It's a case filled with miracles.
God had other plans. She was still alive.
And monsters.
He was a controlling man, very controlling man.
It was crazy. Only Satan is that controlling.
There are legitimate concerns. Will he do this again?
They found 70 human bones behind a grocery store.
He was the devil's child, I would say.
August 5th, 2016, Charlotte, North Carolina. It's the last days of a sweltering summer in the Tar Heel State.
Charlotte is one of the fastest growing cities in America, and that's been that way for decades now.
It's a college town, and UNC Charlotte sits right in the middle of University City Boulevard.
It's a wonderful place, just wonderful.
But as night falls on the charming city, a desperate 911 call comes in to local dispatch.
The dispatch received a very unsettling, disturbing call.
The caller identifies herself as 46-year-old Katrina Paul.
She seemed to be in hotter distress, and she was stumbling over her words.
Katrina said she'd been shot.
Stop me! He shot me! Okay, where did you enter that?
In my head.
You were shot in the head?
Yes, ma'am.
Katrina goes on to say that she isn't the only victim in need of medical assistance.
She said her fiancé, Michael Gretzinger, had also been shot.
Okay, where did you get shot at?
He's in the head.
By the time police arrive on the scene, Katrina is barely conscious.
You take her, I've got him.
And her fiancé, Michael, is in even more dire shape.
Hey, sir, can you hear me?
He was alive, but barely.
I've got a pulse here.
He was non-responsive and unconscious, unable to communicate to them.
Michael was on the brink of death, and they had to move fast if they wanted to save his life.
38-year-old Army veteran Michael Gretzinger had a passion for creativity.
After concluding his time in the military in 2009, he started pursuing some of his other dreams.
He wanted to pursue an acting career.
He also wrote poetry.
He was always looking out for everybody, trying to lift people up and inspire them.
To fund his passions, Michael started working odd jobs around the Charlotte metropolitan area.
Eventually, he found a job at a grocery store.
And it was there he met 44-year-old Katrina Paul.
My mom met Michael at work. They worked together and became close. He was a cool dude.
You say you write poetry?
Yeah, not like Shakespeare or whatever.
Okay.
More like spoken word stuff.
Well, that's really cool.
Michael was drawn to Katrina's bubbly personality.
My mom's very goofy, and her laughter is amazing as well. She laughs about anything. She talks to anyone, and she hugs everybody. That's the warm spirit in her.
as outgoing as she was. She's like, you know, kind of like the life of the party in a sense. And I think he was like one of those kind of guys where like he didn't meet a stranger.
It wasn't long before the two became more than just co-workers.
They would be around each other and it was kind of like a puppy love kind of thing. They had that kind of newfound love that felt familiar. I could tell that my mom was happy.
After just 6 months of dating, Michael proposed.
When Michael wanted to take it to the next level with my mom, I gave him my blessing because he was so respectable about it. He didn't want to impose, he didn't want to intrude. And I'm a mama's boy, so that was important to me. It only felt natural that they would be looking for happily ever after.
And as their wedding day drew near, everything seemed to be going the happy couple's way.
The two started to look for a place to live together, and they found a place in the university area of Charlotte.
She was super excited. We talked about her decorating and decor and things like that.
Michael also found a new job in radio that he really enjoyed.
He went on to become a well-known and respected, fun-loving radio DJ.
For Michael and Katrina, it seemed like the sky was the limit.
They had like this kind of like glow, sparkle kind of romance.
But now, first responders have arrived at the couple's apartment to find them both suffering from gunshot wounds to the head.
Paramedics determined that both were in very serious condition and in need of immediate medical care.
It was a miracle that either of them was still alive.
And as an ambulance rushes them to the closest hospital, their lives hang in the balance.
It quickly became a race against the clock.
It's unclear if either will see the light of day in the morning.
After settling down in Charlotte, North Carolina, 38-year-old Michael Gretzinger was pursuing his dreams with the support and encouragement of the woman he loved, Katrina Paul.
My mom met Michael at work and fell in love. They were together about 6 months before he proposed, and they moved in together.
The engaged couple was looking forward to what the future held in store for them.
I think they just were excited about taking it to the next level. It was like that commitment to each other for the rest of their lives.
But now, it's uncertain if they'll even live through the night as paramedics rush them to the emergency room.
They are both clinging to life.
She had been shot in the head twice and was teetering on the edge of consciousness the entire time. But he was in much worse condition than she was. He was non-responsive.
While ER doctors work to stabilize the couple, detectives arrive at their apartment and begin trying to piece together what happened.
Why would somebody do this to somebody, first of all? And how do we get them behind bars and pay the penalty?
Unfortunately, detectives don't find much evidence left behind.
Investigators do not find any signs of forced entry or robbery at the scene of the crime.
To the detectives, this suggests a crime of methodical execution. Michael and his girlfriend were not the victims of a random crime.
They were targeted by someone they knew.
And one of the responding officers already has a lead on a possible suspect.
I saw someone when we first arrived.
The officer said when he arrived at the apartment complex, he saw a man running with a towel.
Hey!
The officer explains he tried to run after the mysterious individual, but he soon disappeared into the night.
The officer said that he saw him about 60 yards away, and so he wasn't able to give a very good description.
Be on the lookout for a black male, 5'9", green shirt.
Okay. Thanks, Al.
Thank you.
Armed with this description, the officers start knocking on the doors of neighbors, looking to see if they can provide any more additional information.
Unfortunately, none of the neighbors has seen a man matching the suspect's description.
None of the people that the officers spoke to reported seeing anyone in a green shirt the night before, and actually had no recollection of anyone fitting that description living in the community at all.
Meanwhile, news of the shooting is spreading to Katrina and Michael's loved ones.
I got a call. It was a detective on the phone. He was like, well, I need you to get to Carolina Medical Center. Your mother's been in a fatal accident. I tried to not cry, but I couldn't help it. I was just emotional, and I was a nervous wreck.
As Nikki races to the hospital, she tries to get the rest of her siblings on the phone.
I started calling my brothers, TJ and Ty, my sister as well.
I answered her phone, and it was like my mother was in the hospital, that she's been shot. At the time, I didn't know what was going on, who did it. I just got up and went to the hospital.
I think I was either at work or leaving work in Columbia, South Carolina, when I got that call. And I just remember my colleagues saying, it's not safe for you to drive. You shouldn't drive like this. You're too emotional.
When Katrina's children arrive at the hospital, they're overwhelmed with fear and confusion.
It was just like, it was like everything was stopped. It was in slow motion at that time. Like, I just wanted to see my mama and make sure she was okay at that time.
Seeing my mother on that bed, it was something that I never thought I would see.
Michael was on the same floor of the hospital. I remember wanting to go visit with him and see how he was doing, and I wasn't allowed to.
Detectives are hoping family members might have a lead on who did this to the beloved couple.
They asked me, do I know what happened or did I know? I'm like, sir, no.
Do you know anyone who would want to hurt your mother or Michael?
No. They're just really nice, everyday people, you know?
The family was shocked that this had happened. They were a couple that generally just spent most of their time with each other.
It was nothing I could tell them. I had the slightest idea.
They were very loving, kind, and gentle people. Not the type of couple or individuals to have enemies.
But Nikki says there's something else she needs to tell the investigators.
Me and my brothers, we've been trying to get a hold of our sister Star to let her know what's going on, but she's not answering her phone.
We calling and calling and calling and calling and calling Star. She never picked up. She never answered the phone.
I remember asking, where's my sister? Where's Star?
We're really worried about her.
No one had been able to get in touch with her, and they were unable to reach her by phone for several hours. It was very concerning.
If Star knew what was going on, she would have been there. So a lot of things was just going through my head about what could have happened or what's going on.
Now the family is starting to worry. Could she be another victim in this crime?
"38-year-old radio DJ Michael Gretzinger and his fiancée Katrina Paul are undergoing emergency surgery after being shot in the head in their Charlotte apartment.
The couple's loved ones couldn't believe what had just happened. No one can really imagine who could do something like this.
But while speaking to police at the hospital, Katrina's children have just revealed another cause for concern. Their sister, Star Meters, is missing.
Star was the only one that didn't come to the hospital. She didn't show up. She didn't answer the phone for none of us. She didn't call back or anything.
There's absolutely no way that something like this would have happened, and she wouldn't have been by her mother's side.
Just the fact that she's not here right now, something's got to be wrong.
Star's siblings tell the detectives that she was closer to their mother than any of them.
She was more of a mama's girl than me, you know?
She was very passionate about the things that she loved, family being probably number one.
Has your sister ever disappeared like this before? No, never.
My sister's not nowhere to be found, and our mother's laying in the hospital bed. Something ain't adding up.
They're starting to worry she could be another victim in this crime.
You're already looking at 2 victims. It's not a far stretch to think that there might be a third.
When's the last time you spoke with your sister?
A few weeks ago, she came over to the house.
She called me and told me she had somebody with her. And when she showed up, the person she had with her was Tim.
Nikki explains that Timothy Crumedy is her mother's ex, the man she was with before Michael.
Him and my mother, they dated for some years, but then they broke up a couple years ago.
The family goes on to tell the investigators that Timothy was the pastor of a church nearby in Concord, North Carolina.
The first time I met Tim was in middle school. I was like 12 or 13.
I never liked him at all. Like, I guess it was just the feeling that I got of his presence.
He did a lot of things behind closed doors. Timothy tried to be two different people.
They had an on and off again relationship. You would see him and then you wouldn't.
Katrina's family says that the more turbulent their relationship became, the more Tim showed his true colors.
Over the course of her relationship with Tim, he became more and more controlling.
Abusive physically, I really never seen, but his words was very abusive.
And after over 10 years together, Katrina finally had enough.
She put an end to this on again and off again relationship.
When he came over to our house that day with Star, he was definitely trying to weasel his way back into our lives. What is he doing here?
Just hear him out.
Listen, I really miss you guys. For a while there, I thought we was family, right?
I guess.
I got you a little something.
He tried to make a peace offering with me. He tried to bring me some liquor.
Thanks, Tim.
I apologize for everything. I hope you forgive me so we can be in each other's lives again.
That's very kind of you.
Tell your mom hello for me, okay?
Star was more forgiving, but Nikki was not buying it.
I'm like, okay, cool. Because people don't like in my house.
I'm the oldest, so I definitely remember more about my mom's relationship with Tim, more than Star does.
Investigators agreed that Tim's behavior did seem concerning. They definitely wanted to talk to him, and as soon as possible.
But could a man of God really be capable of this kind of attack?
Hey, come here. You're gonna want to take a look at this.
They were shocked to find that he had an alarming and long criminal history, spanning back as far as 25 years. And this isn't the first time he's been suspected of murder.
North Carolina police investigating the shooting of Michael Gretzinger and his fiancée Katrina Paul have discovered that Katrina's 29-year-old daughter, Star, is also missing.
Nobody could find her. She was just like, she just fell off the earth. I was calling and calling and calling and calling and calling people, but nobody saw her or seen her.
Detectives have also learned that Katrina's volatile ex, Timothy Crumedy, had recently been trying to rekindle a relationship with the family.
Timothy is a local pastor at a church in Concord, North Carolina.
But while Tim may preach the word of God, his rap sheet is more befitting of a career criminal.
Hey, come here and take a look at this.
Police records indicated that Tim has spent nearly a decade of his life behind bars.
Timothy was a good manipulator, so he made himself look good, but was also a bad person at the same time.
Arrest records show that Tim's first serious run-in with the law dates back to 1989.
In September of that year, Tim was arrested for armed robbery and receiving stolen goods in Onslow County, North Carolina.
For his crime, Tim was sentenced to 8 years in prison and finally released in 1998.
After he was released, it seemed like Tim was just living a normal, law-abiding citizen type of life.
He got a job with a flooring company in Kannapolis, a city just north of Charlotte, and he was also serving as a pastor for a local church.
But just a few years later, Tim found himself back on the wrong side of the law.
In June of 2005, the boss at the flooring company where Tim worked, Danny Johnson, was found shot to death in a local park.
Danny was last seen alive with Tim at a bank in Charlotte. Danny had loaned Tim $5,000 to pay off a debt.
In September of that same year, police working the case arrested Tim for murder, under the assumption he killed Danny to avoid having to pay back the $5,000 loan.
He spent the next 5 years in Mecklenburg County Jail awaiting trial.
But after a lengthy investigation failed to turn up any physical evidence tying Tim to Danny Johnson's death, the DA was forced to drop the charges for fear of not being able to secure a guilty verdict at trial.
And in 2013, Tim was at the center of yet another homicide investigation.
On July 3rd, 2013, Tim called 911 and claimed that an armed intruder shot his then-wife, Sharon.
Tim said he managed to get the gun away from the robber and shot him in the head.
He essentially described it as some sort of robbery gone wrong.
But the evidence at the crime scene didn't add up with Tim's version of events.
The robber was identified as a handyman from the neighborhood, James Luther Banks.
James and Sharon both died of gunshot wounds to the head, while Tim walked away unscathed.
James did not have a history of violent crime, and his family says that he's the furthest thing from a thief or a violent killer.
Compared it to Tim, who already had a criminal record and was suspected in a prior homicide, it just didn't add up.
Despite the suspicions surrounding Tim and his version of events, police could never prove that he was lying, and so he was never actually charged with the death of these two people.
After being involved in 2 homicides, you would think Tim would lay low. But less than 6 months later, he became a subject of another police investigation.
In December 2013, Tim's house burned to the ground. Investigation revealed that he was the person that set his house on fire.
Finally, investigators were able to turn up enough evidence to put Tim behind bars for arson and insurance fraud. But his shady history still doesn't end there.
Shortly after his release from jail, Tim befriended an elderly woman in Rowan County and moved in with her. Tim managed to convince her to appoint him as her power of attorney and was responsible for her estate. Then in April 2016, this woman died under suspicious circumstances, and Tim was the executor of her estate.
There was whispers that he killed her for her money, but that's all they ever were, whispers.
Soon after, Tim moved to Concord, North Carolina for a fresh start and got another job as a preacher. It was there he met Katrina Paul and her family.
It wasn't too much of a big church. It was a growing church, but he was a good preacher.
However, to the investigators in Charlotte, one thing is now clear. Tim Crumedy was far from a righteous man.
Tim was not the servant of God everyone thought he was, the upstanding citizen. Instead, he was a career criminal with a trail of bodies in his wake.
Homicide.
And when detectives receive a call from the hospital where Michael and Katrina are undergoing treatment, it sounds like Tim's body count may have just gone up.
Despite the doctor's best efforts, they were unable to remove the bullets from Michael's brain because they had gone so far through. And unfortunately, he succumbed to his injuries.
I sat there as he took actually his last breath.
When I learned that Michael passed away, it hurt me because I knew how much my mother loved Michael. I knew how much Michael loved my mother.
But in spite of the tragic news, there's also a glimmer of hope.
The doctors had better news about Katrina.
Miraculously, neither bullet penetrated her brain.
She was in stable condition.
Okay, we'll be right there.
And she's ready to talk to detectives.
Despite her weak condition, she was very ready to tell them exactly what happened to her.
Homicide detectives in Charlotte, North Carolina are zeroing in on Tim Crumity as the prime suspect in the shootings of Michael Gretzinger and his fiancée, Katrina Paul.
Michael unfortunately passed away from his injuries at the hospital, but doctors were able to save Katrina.
Now that Katrina is out of surgery and in stable condition, she's ready to speak with detectives.
Despite her weak condition, she was very ready to tell them exactly what happened to her.
She tells investigators that there's no doubt in her mind who shot her.
She says it was Tim Crumity.
Timothy. He always put on this persona that he was a great man, that he was a child of God, and he really wasn't.
Katrina tells the detectives when she first met Tim almost 2 decades ago, she had no idea his pious persona was a total sham.
About 2001, my mom came home from church one Sunday. She had a great service and she wanted us to come to church with her next Sunday. I said, okay, cool, we go to church. The pastor was Tim.
Katrina and Tim hit it off from day one.
When she first met Tim, she was enamored by him.
He spoiled my mom, and he did everything that he could to keep her happy.
But once they started dating, Katrina began to see a different side of her pastor boyfriend.
Over time, Tim became more and more controlling in their relationship. He wanted to know who Kim was talking to. Where was she going? Who was she with? When would she be back?
He had been stalking her and peeking through our windows and stuff. It was crazy. Only Satan is that controlling.
Eventually, Katrina realized she needed to find a way out of the relationship.
She had made several attempts to remove Timothy from her life. I think she went about it the way, we're all taught, you don't accept phone calls, you move away.
She took a restraining order out on him because he was crazy. He just became obsessed with her.
Then, in 2014, she met Michael Gretzinger.
She realized when she met Michael that she was with someone who respected her, who loved her.
My mother was happy and in love.
Katrina felt like she'd finally erased him from her life until the night of August 5th, 2016.
Katrina and Michael were supposed to go out on a date that night, but on their way to the restaurant, Katrina realized she had forgotten her phone.
She realized she left her cell phone at home, so they turned around to go back.
But when they arrived back home, there was an unwelcome surprise waiting for them.
Somehow, Timothy found out where my mother lived, and he got into the apartment.
Tim, what are you
Shut
doing
up.
here?
Shut up. You, get over there. Okay. Get on your knees.
Okay. Take it easy. Take it easy.
She watched in horror as Tim forced Michael to his knees.
Then he fired 2 shots into his head.
Timothy shot Michael and left him bleeding on the floor.
But for Katrina, her waking nightmare was only beginning.
He then tied her hands behind her back and forced her into the passenger seat of her own car, and then drove her to his home in Rowan County.
He kept her there for several hours, just trying to figure out what to do, before ultimately putting her back in the car.
From there, Tim drove Katrina to a rural area on the outskirts of Charlotte.
He pulled her out of the car, and Tim told her to turn around.
She thought he was about to untie her and set her free.
But instead, Tim drew his weapon.
He raised his gun and shot her in the back of the head. Once she fell to the ground, he aimed and fired again.
With her ears ringing, Katrina thought for sure she was dying.
But God had other plans. She was still alive.
If Katrina wanted to continue living, Tim couldn't find out that her heart was still beating, and beating faster than ever.
She continued to play dead as Tim loaded her in the trunk of his car and drove her to another location.
When the car stopped and Katrina heard Tim get out, she kept waiting.
She waited in the trunk in darkness, unsure what would happen next.
Eventually, she decided she needed to get help if she was gonna survive.
She started to try and get out of the trunk, pushing against the back of the seat and feeling around to see if there was anything that would help her get out.
My mother got out the trunk from a latch that was in the trunk that you can pull.
As she emerged from the trunk, she was relieved to see she was back at her apartment complex.
Miraculously, she was able to stumble upstairs and call 911.
You were shot in the head?
Yes, ma'am.
She was fading, like she was trying to leave, but she was too strong. She was fighting it.
It's extremely rare to survive a gunshot wound to the head, but 2 gunshots, that's practically unheard of.
However, the joy over Katrina's miraculous recovery is marred by the ongoing investigation into her daughter's disappearance.
Did Tim say anything to you about Anastasia?
About Star? No, why?
To go through an ordeal like that, only to pull through and to realize that your child is missing, that had to be a devastating blow.
We know that you've been through a lot already.
We're going to find her.
Armed with Katrina's statement, the investigators are ready to make their move on Tim Crumedy.
They have all the evidence they need to arrest Tim. Police take Tim into custody that Sunday.
Police charged him with first-degree murder and also assault, kidnapping, and attempted murder.
Tim's congregation is stunned.
When you're a pastor, people trust you. The congregation trusts you. They believe in you. They believe that you're giving the word of God. And to have this happen, you know, the public was actually so shocked at all of it.
But where is Katrina's youngest daughter, Star?
Investigators really believed he knew where Star was.
They feel like they are at Tim's mercy to get the information they need about her disappearance.
After surviving the brutal attack that claimed her fiancé's life, Katrina Paul has told detectives that the man responsible for pulling the trigger is her ex-boyfriend, Tim Crumedy.
I just thought it was a miracle that she survived. It's proof that not only is God watching over us, but he's not done with her yet.
Now, North Carolina police have taken Tim into custody and are trying to get a confession out of him, as well as the whereabouts of Katrina's missing daughter, Star.
Where is she, Tim?
Unfortunately, Tim isn't forthcoming.
I have nothing to say to you. I want an attorney.
Tim refused to admit to anything.
While Tim is booked into jail to await trial, the investigators continue their efforts to find Star.
The detectives did their best. They tried, but no one could find her.
I never accepted that she was gone, not for a second. I still had hope that my sister was somewhere.
But as more time passes, that hope becomes harder to hold on to.
It was months, and then it was years. And as Tim's trial approached, they still didn't have any answers about what happened to Anastasia.
I was angry. I was very angry.
I just felt so sorrowful for the family, the suffering they went through. I don't know how they deal with that burden.
Despite their pain, Katrina's family is standing strong by their mother's side when Tim's trial gets underway in February 2018.
When prosecutors make their opening statements, they contend that this crime was about one thing: control.
Timothy was a controlling man. He was a very controlling man.
When Katrina broke up with him and started dating Michael, prosecutors said that lit a flame of jealousy in his heart.
The thought of being rejected It pushed him over the edge.
According to the prosecution, the events that played out on the night of August 5th, 2016, were the direct result of Tim's unbridled jealousy and rage.
Tim executed his romantic rival in cold blood and attempted to do the same to his ex-girlfriend. But by sheer luck, she managed to survive.
Among the prosecution's first witnesses was the first officer on the scene, who testified that he saw someone in a green t-shirt running away on the night in question. In court, he identified Tim Cremity as that person he saw running away.
Investigators thought he may have grabbed a towel from Katrina's apartment to wipe his fingerprints from the crime scene.
But the prosecution's most powerful witness by far is Katrina Paul herself.
Before Katrina took the stand, they played her audio from her 911 call, and it just sent a chill through the entire courtroom.
He shot me. He shot me.
I heard my mom on that 911 call, and I just lost it.
To have that played in a courtroom and broadcast everywhere, that is one brave woman.
Brave enough to take the stand and confront the man who shot her face to face.
It was the first time that she had seen Tim since that night, and he stared at her coldly as she testified.
Katrina was able to describe her incredible story of survival to the jury about getting kidnapped by her ex, shot in the head not once but twice, and escaping from the trunk of the car to get help. It's nothing short of a miracle that she survived to tell them what happened to her.
When the jury retires to deliberate, they take 2 full days to weigh the evidence.
In the end, they found Tim guilty of first-degree murder of Michael Gretzinger, as well as the kidnapping and attempted murder of Katrina Paul.
Tim Cremity is sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
The public was so shocked at all of it. Shocked that a man who professed to be the representative of God would do this.
For Katrina Paul and her loved ones, it's gratifying to see Tim sent away for life. But no punishment can make up for what he did to them.
I don't feel like justice been served, only because he's still here.
I thought it was too lenient. I thought there's ever a time where capital punishment should be in play. I thought this was one of those times.
And even after Tim is sentenced for his attack on Michael and Katrina, her family still doesn't have answers on Anastasia's whereabouts.
Everyone believed Tim had something to do with her disappearance, but he wouldn't talk.
Another year goes by without any new developments in the case. But on January 15th, 2019, deputies with the Iredell County Sheriff's Office just outside Charlotte receive a chilling 911 call.
Somebody was going to look at some land in Mooresville, and he came across some remains.
They found 70 human bones strewn about a wooded area behind a grocery store.
That evidence was sent eventually to North Carolina State Forensic Team.
It was Anastasia Meters.
For Anastasia's family, it's bittersweet news.
When I found out that it was my sister, I just broke down. We didn't have to look no further. We knew that she was on her journey to heaven.
After that, I just felt cold. I just felt like, I felt a lot of anger.
I'm an older sister, and looking at I would have traded tastes with her.
Although the motive for Starr's murder is still unclear, her family believes it was just another way Tim tried to get back at Katrina for leaving him.
Tim is still the main suspect in Anastasia's murder, but the case is still ongoing and he has not been tried for the crime.
I think that no one imagines these kind of things happening.
This kind of person is moving amongst us every single day. There are other Tim Cremitys out there.
He was the devil's child, I would say.
Don't ever think it can't happen to you, because it really can.
If nothing else, the incident showed us how much we do truly love each other.
Tim didn't take everything from me. He thought he did, but he didn't. I still have my mother. She's still beautiful and strong. It only made her strong. It didn't break us.
In the summer of 1988, the city of Fort Wayne, Indiana, was a place where children rode their bicycles through quiet neighborhoods, families gathered in local parks, and the expectation of safety was rarely questioned. That sense of normalcy was shattered over a single weekend when 8-year-old April Marie Tinsley disappeared, setting in motion one of the most significant homicide investigations in Indiana's history. More than 3 decades later, the case would become internationally known as an example of how advances in forensic science, particularly investigative genetic genealogy, could help solve crimes that had once seemed impossible to close. April Tinsley was 8 years old when she vanished on April 1st, SIL, 1988. She had spent the day visiting relatives in the community of Leo, just northeast of Fort Wayne. During the afternoon, she left on foot to deliver a note to a nearby friend, a trip that should have taken only a few minutes. When she did not return, concern quickly turned into alarm. Family members began searching the surrounding streets, calling neighbors, and retracing the route she was expected to have taken. As the hours passed without any sign of April, local law enforcement was notified, and an intensive search effort began. Police officers, firefighters, volunteers, and residents searched fields, wooded areas, roadsides, and neighborhoods throughout the evening and into the following day. Search teams worked against time, hoping the missing child would be found alive. Every passing hour increased the urgency. Investigators interviewed friends, relatives, and anyone who might have seen a young girl walking through the neighborhood that Friday afternoon. Tips arrived rapidly, but none immediately explained what had happened. The search ended in tragedy on April 2nd, when April's body was discovered in a rural ditch in neighboring DeKalb County, approximately 20 miles from where she had disappeared. Investigators determined that she had been abducted, sexually assaulted, and murdered. The discovery transformed what had begun as a missing child investigation into a homicide inquiry that would challenge detectives for decades. The crime shocked not only Fort Wayne but communities throughout Indiana. Parents who had previously allowed their children to play outside without constant supervision suddenly changed their routines. Schools reminded students about personal safety, neighborhoods organized watch groups, and local media provided continuous coverage as residents searched for answers. For many people who lived in northeastern Indiana, the murder marked a dividing line between a time when children were perceived to be relatively safe and a new era defined by greater caution and fear. Investigators processed the crime scene carefully, collecting physical evidence that they believed might eventually identify the person responsible. At the time, forensic DNA analysis was still in its infancy in the United States. Detectives preserved biological evidence, recognizing that advances in science might one day provide investigative opportunities unavailable in 1988. That decision would ultimately prove critical, although no one involved could have predicted how long the wait would be. As the investigation expanded, hundreds of interviews were conducted. Officers examined the victim's movements, reconstructed her final known route, and sought information from anyone who had been in the area that afternoon. Leads arrived from across Indiana and beyond, but each required careful evaluation. Detectives pursued possible suspects, investigated reported sightings, and eliminated numerous individuals whose involvement could not be supported by evidence. The emotional impact on April's family and the wider community remained profound. Memorial services brought together friends, neighbors, and strangers united by grief. The image of an energetic 8-year-old whose life had ended so violently became deeply embedded in public memory. Newspapers and television stations continued to report developments, while investigators repeatedly appealed for additional information from the public. As weeks turned into months, the investigation entered a more difficult phase. Despite sustained efforts, no arrest was made. The case increasingly came to be described as a cold case, even though detectives never stopped reviewing evidence and following new information. Physical evidence collected in 1988 remained securely preserved, reflecting investigators' belief that future scientific advances might eventually reveal what traditional investigative methods could not. The April Tinsley case would later gain national attention not only because of the brutality of the crime, but also because of the determination of investigators who continued working the case across multiple generations of detectives. Files were revisited, evidence was re-examined, and technological developments continually opened new possibilities. Each advancement renewed hope that the individual responsible might someday be identified. Looking back, the events of April 1988 fundamentally changed the community. Families remembered where they were when they first heard that a local child had disappeared. Law enforcement agencies refined investigative procedures for missing child cases, and the case remained an enduring reminder of both the devastating impact of violent crime and the importance of preserving evidence, even when immediate answers appear out of reach. The story of April Tinsley's murder is therefore more than the story of a single criminal investigation. It is also the story of a community confronted by tragedy, of investigators committed to pursuing justice over decades, and of scientific progress that would eventually transform the possibilities of cold case investigations. The search for answers did not end in 1988. It continued through changing technologies, changing investigative teams, and changing generations, driven by the determination that even after many years, the truth remained worth pursuing. The weeks following April Tinsley's murder became a defining period for Fort Wayne and the surrounding communities of northeastern Indiana. What had begun as a frantic search for a missing child quickly evolved into one of the largest homicide investigations the region had ever experienced. Detectives from local agencies, assisted by the Indiana State Police and later federal partners, worked to reconstruct every known moment of April's final afternoon. They established timelines, interviewed family members, friends, neighbors, motorists, and anyone who might have crossed paths with an 8-year-old girl walking through Leo on April 1st, SIL, 1988. Every reported sighting was carefully compared against physical evidence and witness accounts. Yet despite the intensity of the investigation, no immediate suspect emerged. The uncertainty weighed heavily on the community. Parents altered their daily routines almost overnight. Children who had once walked to school, visited friends, or played outside without much thought were now accompanied by adults. Schools reviewed safety procedures, community organizations hosted child safety programs, and neighborhood watch efforts expanded. The fear was not driven simply by the fact that a terrible crime had occurred, but by the realization that the person responsible had not been identified. Residents understood that investigators believed the offender had likely passed unnoticed through ordinary neighborhoods before disappearing again. Law enforcement maintained a visible presence throughout the area. Officers continued conducting interviews and evaluating new leads as they arrived. Hundreds of tips flowed into the investigation from people reporting suspicious vehicles, unfamiliar individuals, or unusual encounters occurring around the time of April's disappearance. Detectives examined each report systematically, recognizing that even a seemingly insignificant observation might later prove meaningful when combined with other evidence. Investigators also reviewed known offenders, compared information from neighboring jurisdictions, and sought assistance from agencies with experience in crimes against children. At the center of the investigation remained the physical evidence collected during the initial examination. Crime scene specialists documented every recoverable detail using the forensic techniques available in 1988. Biological evidence, trace materials, photographs, and laboratory findings were carefully preserved. Although DNA profiling was only beginning to emerge as an investigative tool during that period, experienced investigators understood the importance of safeguarding evidence for future examination. Decisions made during those first days would ultimately preserve opportunities that could not yet be fully realized. Media coverage remained constant. Local newspapers printed updates almost daily, while television stations reported developments and repeated appeals for information. April's photograph became familiar throughout Indiana, symbolizing not only the loss suffered by one family, but also the uncertainty affecting an entire region. Community members attended vigils, expressed support for investigators, and hoped each new announcement might finally identify the person responsible. Despite extensive investigative work, progress remained limited. Detectives publicly emphasized that the absence of an arrest did not indicate a lack of effort. Rather, it reflected the challenge of solving a crime committed with few direct witnesses and limited forensic technology by the standards of the late 1980s. Every promising lead required verification, and many ultimately proved unrelated after careful investigation. Although disappointment accompanied each dead end, investigators continued reviewing evidence methodically rather than drawing unsupported conclusions. As months passed, the case gradually shifted from an active breaking news story to an enduring investigation that required patience and persistence. New detectives joining the agencies learned the details from experienced investigators who had worked the original scene. Case files expanded with interview transcripts, laboratory reports, maps, photographs, and documented leads. Periodic reviews ensured that previously collected evidence remained available for future testing as forensic science evolved. For April's family, however, time did not lessen the significance of what had happened. Public attention naturally fluctuated as new events occupied headlines, but the family's search for justice remained unchanged. Community members continued remembering April through memorial events and public discussions about child safety, ensuring that her name was not forgotten even as years passed without an arrest. The investigation would eventually become recognized as one of Indiana's most significant long-term cold cases, not because detectives stopped working, but because they continued returning to the evidence whenever new scientific techniques became available. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, forensic laboratories advanced significantly, allowing investigators to extract and analyze biological evidence with greater precision than had been possible at the time of the crime. Detectives repeatedly submitted preserved evidence for updated testing whenever improvements in technology justified renewed examination. These advances reflected a broader transformation occurring across criminal investigations nationwide. Cases once believed unsolvable were beginning to benefit from increasingly sophisticated DNA analysis. Investigators across the United States recognized that evidence collected decades earlier could sometimes produce new investigative opportunities if preserved correctly. The April Tinsley investigation became one of many examples illustrating the long-term value of meticulous evidence preservation and comprehensive case documentation. Even so, each technological improvement raised expectations that were not always immediately fulfilled. New laboratory results could exclude individuals previously considered persons of interest, narrowing the investigation while simultaneously eliminating potential avenues of inquiry. Detectives accepted these outcomes as valuable progress because eliminating innocent individuals strengthened the integrity of the investigation and focused attention on evidence-supported possibilities. As another anniversary approached, community members continued to reflect on the lasting impact of April's murder. Children who had grown up hearing about the case were now adults with families of their own. Many still remembered the widespread searches, the newspaper headlines, and the sense of uncertainty that followed. The investigation had become part of the region's collective memory, reminding residents both of a devastating crime and of the enduring commitment by law enforcement to continue seeking answers. Although the identity of the offender remained unknown during those years, investigators never described the case as abandoned. Instead, they consistently emphasized that preserved evidence, careful documentation, and future scientific advances offered continuing hope. That persistence shared by detectives, forensic specialists, prosecutors, and April's family ensured that the investigation remained active long after public attention had faded. Decades would pass before new forensic methods fundamentally changed the direction of the case. But the foundation for that breakthrough had been established during the earliest days of the investigation, when every piece of evidence was carefully collected, preserved, and protected for a future that investigators could only imagine. In the years that followed, the April Tinsley investigation entered a phase familiar to many major cold cases across the United States. Public attention gradually shifted to newer headlines, yet inside law enforcement offices the case never truly disappeared. Detectives continued to review the evidence, revisit witness statements, and evaluate new information whenever it surfaced. Every anniversary prompted renewed appeals to the public, accompanied by the same hope that someone might remember a forgotten detail or recognize a connection that had gone unnoticed years earlier. Although no breakthrough immediately emerged, the investigation remained active because investigators believed that the person responsible had not simply vanished. Rather, he had blended back into everyday life. One of the most unsettling developments occurred several years after the murder. In 1990, and again in 1991, disturbing written messages connected to the case were discovered in the Fort Wayne area. The messages, left on or inside mailboxes, referred to April Tinsley in explicit and threatening language. Investigators examined these communications carefully because they appeared to demonstrate knowledge of the crime that was not publicly available. The possibility that the author could be the offender immediately elevated their importance. For detectives, these messages represented both an opportunity and a challenge. On one hand, they suggested that the individual responsible might still be living nearby and was willing to communicate in a way that risked drawing attention to himself. On the other hand, investigators had to determine whether the writer was truly connected to the murder or merely attempting to exploit a tragedy that had deeply affected the community. Every aspect of the writings, including their wording, handwriting, physical materials, and locations, became part of the investigation. The letters intensified public concern. Residents who had hoped the danger had passed realized that someone appeared to be invoking the memory of April years after her death. Parents remained vigilant, and schools continued emphasizing child safety. Local media reported the discovery of the messages while withholding certain investigative details at the request of law enforcement. Detectives understood that protecting specific information was essential. Knowledge known only to the offender could later help verify the credibility of future evidence or confessions. As the investigation continued, forensic specialists analyzed the available physical evidence using the best methods available at the time. Throughout the early 1990s, DNA technology was improving rapidly, but its capabilities remained far more limited than they would become decades later. Scientists conducted testing where possible, preserving remaining biological material for future examination whenever additional analysis might consume valuable evidence. This careful balance between present investigative needs and future scientific possibilities became increasingly important. Investigators also broadened the search beyond local boundaries. Information about the case was shared with agencies across Indiana and neighboring states. Detectives compared the circumstances of April's murder with other crimes involving children, searching for patterns that might indicate a serial offender or a previously unidentified connection. While similarities occasionally appeared, none produced sufficient evidence to establish a direct link. Each comparison, nevertheless, helped eliminate possibilities and refine the focus of the investigation. During this period, thousands of investigative records accumulated. Every interview, laboratory report, map, photograph, and tip was preserved. Detectives recognized that cold case investigations often depended on the ability to revisit old information with fresh perspectives. A witness statement that seemed insignificant in 1988 might assume greater importance years later when combined with newly developed evidence. Consequently, maintaining complete and organized records became as important as pursuing new leads. The investigation also reflected broader changes occurring within American law enforcement. By the mid-1990s, DNA profiling had begun solving cases that previously appeared impossible to resolve. National databases expanded investigators' ability to compare biological evidence with known offenders. Although these systems represented remarkable advances, they depended upon matching crime scene DNA to individuals whose genetic profiles were already lawfully available within the database. If the offender had never been entered into those systems, the comparison would produce no identification. For the April Tinsley investigation, this limitation proved significant. Detectives possessed biological evidence, but no database match identified the perpetrator. The absence of a match did not mean the evidence lacked value. Rather, it suggested that the individual responsible had either never submitted DNA to the applicable databases or otherwise remained outside their reach. Investigators therefore continued pursuing traditional methods alongside emerging forensic technologies. Community members frequently asked whether the case would ever be solved. Law enforcement officials consistently responded that they remained committed to the investigation, even when progress appeared slow. Advances in forensic science had already transformed criminal investigations nationwide, and detectives believed additional breakthroughs were likely in the future. Their confidence rested not on speculation, but on the careful preservation of evidence collected during the original investigation. The emotional impact of the case also endured. Memorial events continued to honor April's memory, while local media periodically revisited the investigation during significant anniversaries. Each renewed report served two purposes: remembering the victim and encouraging anyone with relevant information to come forward. Detectives understood that memories can change over time. Individuals unwilling to speak years earlier might later decide to cooperate, and relationships or circumstances preventing disclosure could evolve. As technology advanced into the early 21st century, forensic laboratories gained the ability to recover more detailed DNA profiles from evidence that had once yielded only limited results. Investigators submitted preserved evidence for additional examination whenever new methods became available and scientifically justified. Each round of testing represented another opportunity, even if immediate identification remained elusive. Despite these efforts, the investigation remained unresolved for many years. Yet within law enforcement, the case was increasingly viewed not as an unsolvable mystery, but as an investigation waiting for the right scientific tool. Detectives who inherited the file from earlier investigators benefited from decades of meticulous documentation, preserved evidence, and disciplined investigative work. The foundation laid in 1988 had never weakened. Instead, it grew stronger as each generation of investigators added new analysis while carefully preserving the integrity of the evidence. Looking back, those years demonstrated that solving a cold case often depends as much on patience as on technology. The absence of immediate answers did not reflect a lack of commitment, but the limitations of the era. Every preserved sample, every documented interview, and every carefully maintained record represented an investment in a future that investigators hoped would eventually provide capabilities unavailable at the time of the crime. In the April Tinsley case, that hope remained alive because the evidence had been protected with extraordinary care, waiting for scientific advances that would one day allow investigators to ask entirely new questions of evidence collected decades earlier. By the late 1990s, nearly a decade had passed since the murder of April Tinsley. The investigation had generated thousands of pages of reports, countless interviews, and extensive forensic examinations, yet no arrest had been made. Despite the passage of time, the Allen County Sheriff's Department and other participating agencies continued to classify the homicide as an active investigation rather than a closed file. Detectives periodically reviewed the evidence, reassessed witness statements, and evaluated new information whenever it became available. One of the greatest challenges facing investigators was the absence of an identified suspect whose DNA could be compared with the biological evidence recovered during the original investigation. Although DNA profiling had become an increasingly valuable forensic tool throughout the 1990s, its usefulness depended on having an appropriate reference sample. National and state DNA databases expanded significantly during this period, allowing investigators to compare evidence against profiles from convicted offenders and, later, certain categories of arrestees. In the April Tinsley investigation, however, repeated database comparisons failed to identify a matching individual. The lack of a database match did not diminish the importance of the preserved biological evidence. Instead, investigators viewed the evidence as one of the strongest components of the case. Laboratory testing confirmed that usable DNA had been successfully recovered and preserved. As forensic science advanced, detectives repeatedly consulted forensic specialists to determine whether additional testing might yield new investigative opportunities. Each technological improvement prompted careful consideration of whether previously collected evidence could produce more detailed results without exhausting the remaining samples. Throughout these years, investigators also revisited the handwritten messages that had been discovered in the Fort Wayne area in 1990 and 1991. Those communications remained a significant element of the investigation because detectives believed they might have been authored by the individual responsible for April's murder. Forensic document examiners analyzed the handwriting and physical characteristics of the materials, while investigators attempted to identify anyone who might recognize the writing or possess relevant information. Despite extensive public attention, no conclusive identification resulted from these efforts. Law enforcement agencies also explored whether April's murder might be connected to other violent crimes involving children. Detectives compared investigative details with cases from Indiana and neighboring states, examining similarities in offender behavior, victim selection, and available forensic evidence. These comparisons reflected standard investigative practice in major unsolved homicide investigations. While certain similarities were identified, investigators did not establish evidence sufficient to confirm that April's murder was linked to another known offender or series of crimes. As forensic databases expanded nationally, detectives routinely submitted the available DNA profile for comparison against newly entered records. Each submission represented another opportunity to identify the perpetrator if he later entered the criminal justice system in a manner requiring DNA collection. These comparisons continued over many years, but no confirmed match was obtained through conventional database searches. The investigation also benefited from improvements in digital record management. Original case files, photographs, laboratory reports, interview summaries, and evidence inventories were carefully preserved and organized to ensure future investigators could efficiently review decades of accumulated information. Cold case investigations often depend upon the ability to revisit historical evidence using modern analytical methods, making accurate documentation an essential component of long-term investigative success. Although public attention naturally declined as years passed, anniversaries of April's disappearance and murder continued to generate renewed media coverage. Local newspapers and television stations periodically interviewed investigators, who consistently emphasized that the case remained open and that new information would be thoroughly investigated. These public appeals served not only to encourage potential witnesses to come forward, but also to remind the community that law enforcement had not abandoned the pursuit of justice. For April Tinsley's family, each passing year represented another reminder that the person responsible had not been identified. Family members continued participating in public efforts to keep the case visible while expressing hope that advances in forensic science might eventually provide the answers that traditional investigative methods had been unable to produce. By the early 2000s, significant developments in DNA technology were transforming criminal investigations across the United States. Laboratories became capable of generating increasingly complete DNA profiles from smaller and more degraded biological samples than had previously been possible. Investigators monitored these developments closely, recognizing that evidence collected in 1988 might yield additional information when examined using newer scientific techniques. At the same time, cold case units across the country demonstrated that preserving evidence could be as important as collecting it. Cases once believed unsolvable were being reopened as improved laboratory methods produced results unavailable during the original investigations. The April Tinsley case increasingly came to represent this principle. Detectives understood that while they could not accelerate scientific progress, they could ensure that every available piece of evidence remained intact for future examination. Despite these advances, investigators remained careful not to overstate expectations. Scientific improvements alone could not guarantee an arrest. New laboratory results still required careful interpretation, corroborating evidence, and adherence to established legal standards before any criminal charges could be pursued. Throughout the investigation, detectives emphasized that every lead would continue to be evaluated according to the available evidence rather than speculation. Looking back at this period, the investigation illustrates the persistence required in long-term homicide cases. Rather than concluding when immediate leads were exhausted, investigators maintained the case through systematic evidence preservation, periodic forensic review, continued public outreach, and ongoing collaboration with forensic laboratories. Those efforts ensured that when future investigative methods became available, the April Tinsley case would be positioned to benefit from them. Although the identity of the offender remained unknown during these years, the careful work performed by generations of investigators preserved the possibility that the evidence would eventually reveal answers that had remained hidden since 1988. By the early 2010s, the investigation into the murder of April Tinsley had entered its third decade. The case remained one of Indiana's most well-known unsolved child homicides, and although no arrest had been made, investigators continued to believe that the preserved physical evidence held the key to identifying the offender. Unlike many older homicide investigations in which biological evidence had been lost, contaminated, or unavailable, the April Tinsley case retained evidence suitable for continued forensic examination. This fact would prove critical as forensic science underwent another period of rapid development. During these years, DNA analysis continued to evolve beyond the methods that had transformed criminal investigations in the 1990s. Traditional DNA profiling remained an essential investigative tool, but it depended largely on comparisons with known reference samples contained in law enforcement databases. If the individual responsible for a crime had never provided a DNA sample that was lawfully entered into those systems, investigators often had no direct means of identifying that person through conventional database searches alone. At the same time, researchers and forensic specialists were exploring new approaches that combine genetics with genealogical research. These developing techniques sought not to identify an individual directly, but to identify biological relatives through publicly available or legally accessible genealogical data. From there, trained genealogists could construct family trees and assist investigators in narrowing the field of possible individuals. Although still relatively new and used only in carefully selected investigations, the method began attracting attention after demonstrating success in several high-profile cold cases. Investigators responsible for the April Tinsley case monitored these developments closely. Before adopting any new forensic method, law enforcement agencies consulted forensic scientists, prosecutors, and legal advisors to determine whether the approach was scientifically reliable and legally appropriate. As with every investigative step, any conclusions derived from genealogical research would still require confirmation through conventional forensic evidence before criminal charges could be pursued. By the late 2010s, investigators decided that the preserved biological evidence from the April Tinsley investigation was suitable for advanced DNA analysis using investigative genetic genealogy. Specialized laboratories generated a DNA profile appropriate for genealogical comparison. Rather than searching only traditional criminal databases, the analysis focused on identifying individuals who shared portions of DNA consistent with distant biological relationships. The results did not immediately identify a suspect. Instead, they produced potential genetic connections to individuals who were related, sometimes only distantly, to the unknown offender. Professional genealogists then undertook the painstaking process of constructing extensive family trees using public records, historical documents, census information, birth and death records, marriage records, and other legally available sources. This work required careful verification at every stage to avoid incorrect conclusions. As family trees expanded across multiple generations, investigators gradually narrowed the pool of possible individuals. Factors such as age, geographic location, family relationships, and historical records helped distinguish individuals who could reasonably be associated with the evidence from those who could be excluded. This investigative process combined traditional detective work with modern forensic science, demonstrating that genetic genealogy was not a substitute for conventional investigation, but rather an additional tool that directed investigators toward potential leads. Throughout this process, detectives remained careful to protect the integrity of the investigation. Individuals identified through genealogical analysis were not treated as suspects solely because of shared genetic relationships. Instead, genealogy served as an investigative lead requiring independent corroboration. Detectives continued gathering documentary evidence, reviewing historical records, and comparing available information with the known facts of the case before focusing attention on any specific individual. Eventually, investigators identified a person whose age, location, and family relationships were consistent with the genealogical findings. At that stage, however, genealogy alone was insufficient. Law enforcement required a direct DNA comparison between the preserved crime scene evidence and a DNA sample attributable to that individual. Detectives therefore initiated surveillance and investigative measures designed to obtain a lawfully abandoned DNA sample without alerting the individual under investigation. Such investigative techniques have long been recognized within criminal investigations. When individuals voluntarily discard items such as used drinking containers, disposable utensils, or other objects carrying biological material in places where there is no reasonable expectation of privacy, investigators may, subject to applicable legal standards, recover those items for forensic examination. The resulting DNA profile can then be compared with evidence recovered from a crime scene. After obtaining an appropriate discarded sample, forensic scientists conducted a direct comparison between the DNA recovered from the abandoned item and the biological evidence preserved from the 1988 investigation. The laboratory analysis concluded that the DNA profiles were consistent, providing investigators with strong forensic evidence that the individual under investigation was the source of the crime scene DNA. Even after receiving this result, investigators proceeded cautiously. Prosecutors and detectives carefully reviewed the evidence to ensure that every investigative step had been properly documented and that the scientific findings met evidentiary standards required for criminal proceedings. Additional investigative work was conducted before law enforcement sought an arrest warrant. The investigation demonstrated how advances in forensic science had fundamentally changed the prospects for solving decades-old crimes. Importantly, the breakthrough did not occur because investigators discovered entirely new evidence. Instead, it resulted from the combination of evidence preserved in 1988, decades of careful investigative work, improvements in DNA technology, and the emergence of investigative genetic genealogy as a lawful forensic tool. For many investigators who had worked the case over the years, the breakthrough represented the culmination of decades of persistence. Some original investigators had retired long before these developments occurred, while newer detectives inherited responsibility for continuing the investigation. The success reflected continuity across generations of law enforcement professionals who maintained the integrity of the evidence and preserved the possibility that future scientific advances would eventually provide answers. The April Tinsley investigation has since been widely studied within the forensic and law enforcement communities because it illustrates several principles relevant to cold case investigations. The importance of preserving biological evidence, maintaining comprehensive investigative records, periodically reevaluating cases as technology evolves, and integrating emerging forensic methods with traditional investigative practices. The case also demonstrated that scientific innovation does not replace careful police work. Rather, it enhances investigators' ability to interpret evidence that has existed for decades. Ultimately, the developments that emerged during this period marked the beginning of the investigation's final phase. After more than 30 years, advances in forensic science had transformed a long unsolved homicide into an investigation supported by strong scientific evidence, creating the foundation upon which prosecutors would later present their case in court. Part 6. Arrest, Prosecution, and the Legacy of the Investigation, Fact-Based Documentary Script. In July 2018, after more than 3 decades of investigation, the Allen County Sheriff's Department announced the arrest of John D. Miller, a resident of Grabille, Indiana, in connection with the murder of April Tinsley. The announcement marked the first major break in the case since April disappeared in April 1988. For investigators who had worked on the case over many years and for April's family and the wider community, the arrest represented the culmination of decades of persistence supported by significant advances in forensic science. According to investigators, the identification of Miller followed the use of investigative genetic genealogy, which had helped narrow the field of possible individuals. Detectives then obtained DNA from an item that Miller had discarded in public. Forensic scientists compared that DNA profile with the biological evidence preserved from the original investigation. The comparison identified Miller as the source of the crime scene DNA. Investigators later obtained an additional DNA sample directly from Miller following his arrest, and laboratory testing confirmed the earlier findings. Law enforcement officials emphasized that the arrest was based on a combination of investigative work and forensic evidence developed over many years. They also noted that the careful preservation of biological evidence collected in 1988 had made the later scientific analysis possible. Investigators repeatedly credited both the original detectives who safeguarded the evidence and the modern forensic specialists whose work ultimately produced the breakthrough. Following his arrest, Miller was formally charged with offenses related to the abduction, sexual assault, and murder of April Tinsley. As with any criminal prosecution, the charges initiated a legal process in which the evidence would be presented before the court. Prosecutors prepared to demonstrate how the forensic evidence, together with the broader investigative record, established Miller's responsibility for the crime. During subsequent court proceedings, Miller ultimately entered a guilty plea. By pleading guilty, he accepted responsibility for the offenses charged, eliminating the need for a full jury trial. His plea also spared April's family the experience of hearing detailed evidence presented during lengthy courtroom proceedings. Under the terms accepted by the court, Miller received a sentence of 80 years in prison. The guilty plea brought legal finality to one of Indiana's longest-running homicide investigations, While the criminal proceedings concluded, investigators continued documenting the methods used during the case because of its significance to the broader law enforcement community. The April Tinsley investigation became one of several widely cited examples demonstrating the practical value of investigative genetic genealogy when combined with properly preserved forensic evidence. Law enforcement agencies across the United States examined the investigation closely. Many departments responsible for unresolved homicides had retained biological evidence from cases dating back decades. The success achieved in the April Tinsley investigation encouraged agencies to reassess whether emerging forensic technologies might provide new investigative opportunities in other cold cases. At the same time, investigators recognized that genetic genealogy is not appropriate or available for every investigation, and that each case requires careful legal, scientific, and ethical review before such methods are employed. The case also reinforced several long-standing principles of criminal investigation. First, meticulous evidence preservation remains essential. Biological samples that appear to have limited value under existing technology may become critically important as scientific methods improve. Second, comprehensive investigative documentation allows future detectives to understand earlier investigative decisions, evaluate previous leads, and integrate new evidence without losing historical context. Finally, successful cold case investigations often depend upon sustained institutional commitment, extending across multiple generations of investigators. For April Tinsley's family, the resolution of the criminal case brought accountability after more than 30 years of uncertainty. Public statements made following the arrest reflected appreciation for the investigators, forensic scientists, prosecutors, and support personnel who had continued working toward identifying the offender long after many observers believed the case might never be solved. While no judicial outcome could reverse the loss suffered in 1988, the conclusion of the criminal proceedings provided factual answers that had remained unavailable for decades. The investigation also contributed to ongoing public discussion regarding investigative genetic genealogy. Legal scholars, forensic scientists, and policymakers have continued examining the technique's benefits, limitations, privacy considerations, and appropriate safeguards. As with many developing investigative methods, its application has been accompanied by evolving legal standards and professional guidelines intended to ensure that scientific advances remain consistent with constitutional protections and accepted forensic practice. Within forensic science, the April Tinsley investigation is frequently referenced as an example of how multiple disciplines can work together effectively. Traditional detective work established the investigative foundation. Crime scene specialists preserved critical evidence. Forensic laboratories maintained the integrity of biological samples across decades. Genealogists analyzed complex family relationships using available records. Prosecutors evaluated the evidence according to legal standards before criminal charges were filed. Each stage depended upon the work completed during earlier phases of the investigation. The case further illustrates that solving long unsolved crimes rarely results from a single moment or isolated discovery. Instead, successful investigations typically reflect the cumulative effect of thousands of investigative decisions made over many years. Every interview documented, every laboratory examination completed, every piece of evidence preserved, and every periodic review contributed to maintaining the possibility of eventual resolution. Scientific advances provided powerful new tools, but those tools proved effective only because investigators had carefully preserved the evidence and records needed for later analysis. Today, the April Tinsley investigation remains an important case study within law enforcement training, forensic science education, and discussions concerning cold case investigations. It demonstrates both the limitations faced by investigators working with the technology available in 1988 and the remarkable capabilities that later emerged through continued scientific development. Equally important, it illustrates the value of persistence. Detectives assigned to the case over 3 decades maintained the investigation even when immediate progress appeared unlikely, understanding that future advances might eventually reveal information beyond the reach of contemporary forensic methods. The resolution of the April Tinsley case stands as a reminder that cold cases are not necessarily abandoned cases. Many remain active investigations supported by preserved evidence, periodic review, and evolving scientific techniques. Although years or even decades may pass without significant public developments, investigators often continue examining available evidence whenever new methods become available. The April Tinsley investigation demonstrates how the combination of diligent police work, careful evidence preservation, and responsible scientific innovation can ultimately provide answers in cases once believed beyond resolution. The resolution of the April Tinsley investigation became more than the conclusion of a single homicide case. Within months of the arrest, investigators, forensic scientists, prosecutors, and law enforcement agencies across the United States began examining the methods that had finally identified the offender after more than 3 decades. The case quickly became one of the most frequently cited examples of how preserved evidence and advances in forensic science could work together to resolve crimes once considered unsolvable. At the center of that discussion was investigative genetic genealogy. Although DNA profiling had been used in criminal investigations for many years, the Tinsley investigation demonstrated how genealogical analysis could generate investigative leads when traditional DNA database searches produced no identification. Importantly, investigators emphasized that genealogy itself did not establish guilt. Instead, it served as an investigative tool that directed detectives toward individuals whose relationship to the unknown DNA warranted further investigation. Every potential lead still required corroboration through conventional police work and direct forensic comparison before any arrest could occur. The investigation also highlighted the importance of evidence preservation. Detectives working the original case in 1988 collected and carefully stored biological evidence using the best practices available at the time. Decades later, that same evidence remained suitable for advanced laboratory analysis. Had the evidence been lost, contaminated, or improperly preserved, later scientific developments might never have been applied successfully. For forensic professionals, the case reinforced the principle that preserving evidence is an investment in future investigative capabilities. Another significant lesson involved continuity across generations of investigators. Few detectives who originally responded to the case remained actively assigned when the arrest occurred in 2018. Responsibility had passed through multiple investigative teams over 30 years. Each generation inherited not only the evidence but also extensive case files, interview records, laboratory reports, maps, photographs, and investigative notes prepared by their predecessors. Maintaining comprehensive documentation ensured that valuable information was not lost as personnel changed over time. The case has also been referenced in professional discussions regarding cold case management. Many agencies maintain dedicated cold case units responsible for periodically reviewing unresolved investigations. Rather than allowing files to remain permanently inactive, these units evaluate whether advances in forensic science, digital technology, or newly available records justify renewed investigative efforts. The April Tinsley investigation demonstrates the value of systematic case review rather than assuming that a lack of immediate progress means a case can never be solved. Training programs for detectives increasingly use cases such as April Tinsley's to illustrate the relationship between traditional investigative techniques and modern forensic science. Detectives still conduct interviews, evaluate witness credibility, verify timelines, examine documentary evidence, and establish legal grounds for every investigative action. New technologies enhance these efforts, but do not replace them. Successful investigations continue to depend upon careful documentation, critical analysis, and adherence to established legal procedures. The case also contributed to broader conversations about investigative genetic genealogy itself. As more agencies considered using this technique, legal experts, forensic scientists, ethicists, and policymakers discussed appropriate safeguards, privacy considerations, and standards governing its use. These discussions have shaped evolving policies intended to ensure that emerging forensic methods are applied responsibly and consistently with constitutional protections. Within Indiana, the investigation remains a significant chapter in the history of criminal justice. It demonstrated the willingness of local and state law enforcement agencies to continue pursuing an investigation long after public attention had diminished. Detectives repeatedly emphasized that unresolved cases are not forgotten simply because years have passed. Evidence continues to be reviewed, technological advances are monitored, and new investigative opportunities are evaluated whenever they arise. For April Tinsley's family, the conclusion of the criminal case represented the end of a legal process that had begun with unimaginable tragedy in 1988. Public statements following the resolution reflected appreciation for the investigators whose persistence ultimately produced answers after decades of uncertainty. Although no criminal prosecution can undo the harm caused by a violent crime, the successful resolution of the investigation established accountability through the judicial process and concluded one of Indiana's longest-running homicide investigations. The broader legacy of the April Tinsley case extends well beyond Indiana. It is frequently studied in forensic science courses, law enforcement training programs, and criminal justice education as an example of how scientific progress can transform long unsolved investigations. It reminds investigators that evidence collected today may become even more valuable tomorrow as laboratory methods continue to evolve. At the same time, it demonstrates that technological breakthroughs are most effective when supported by disciplined investigative work, careful evidence preservation, and sustained institutional commitment. Looking back, the history of the investigation spans 3 decades of changing forensic capabilities. Detectives who began the investigation in 1988 worked with tools that differed dramatically from those available 30 years later. Yet the principles guiding the investigation remained constant. Preserve evidence, document findings carefully, evaluate facts objectively, and continue pursuing lawful investigative opportunities wherever the evidence leads. Those principles, applied consistently across generations of investigators, ultimately enabled the successful resolution of a case that had once appeared beyond the reach of contemporary forensic science. Today, the April Tinsley investigation stands as a documented example of persistence, scientific advancement, and the evolving nature of criminal investigation. Rather than illustrating a single moment of discovery, it demonstrates how decades of careful investigative work, combined with responsible innovation, can eventually provide answers in cases that remain unresolved for many years. Its lasting contribution lies not only in the successful prosecution that concluded the case, but also in the investigative practices and forensic lessons that continue to influence cold case investigations throughout the United States. Long before the phrase investigative genetic genealogy entered the public vocabulary, criminal investigators relied on a more limited form of DNA analysis. Beginning in the late 1980s and expanding throughout the 1990s, forensic DNA profiling transformed criminal investigations by allowing biological evidence recovered from crime scenes to be compared against known reference samples. Over time, national DNA databases such as CODIS became powerful investigative tools, helping law enforcement identify suspects, link crimes committed in different jurisdictions, and exonerate individuals who had been wrongly accused or convicted. Yet these databases also had an important limitation. They could identify only individuals whose DNA profiles had already been lawfully entered into the system. If an offender had never submitted DNA through the criminal justice process, a database search could produce no direct identification. As a result, many investigations reached an impasse despite the presence of high-quality biological evidence. Detectives often knew that the offender's DNA had been recovered from the crime scene, but without a corresponding profile in a forensic database, that evidence could not reveal a name. Thousands of violent crimes across the United States remained unsolved under these circumstances. The challenge was no longer obtaining DNA, it was determining whose DNA it was. At the same time, a separate scientific and technological development was taking place outside the criminal justice system. Commercial DNA testing services became increasingly popular among individuals interested in learning about family origins, ancestry, and biological relationships. Millions of people voluntarily submitted DNA samples for genealogical purposes, contributing to rapidly expanding family history databases. Professional genealogists also gained access to extensive collections of historical records, including census documents, birth certificates, marriage records, military records, newspaper archives, cemetery records, and public family trees. Together, these resources made it possible to identify previously unknown family connections spanning multiple generations. Researchers and forensic specialists eventually recognized that these developments might have investigative value. Rather than searching for an exact DNA match as traditional forensic databases required, they explored whether crime scene DNA could identify biological relatives of an unknown individual. Even distant relatives, sharing only a small portion of DNA, could provide important clues. By combining genetic relationships with historical records, genealogists could construct family trees and gradually narrow the field of potential individuals. This emerging process became known as investigative genetic genealogy, or EGE. Unlike conventional DNA database searches, EGE does not immediately identify a suspect. Instead, it generates investigative leads by identifying possible relatives of the unknown individual. Detectives and genealogists then work together to determine where those family lines intersect, which descendants fit the known facts of the investigation, and which individuals can be eliminated based on age, geography, or other documented evidence. The process is methodical and often time-consuming. After forensic scientists prepare a DNA profile suitable for genealogical analysis, specialized laboratories compare that profile with individuals who have chosen to participate in genealogy databases that permit law enforcement access under specific circumstances. Investigators typically do not find close relatives. More often, they identify distant cousins sharing relatively small amounts of DNA. Professional genealogists must then reconstruct extensive family histories, sometimes extending back several generations before tracing descendants forward again. Each relationship must be verified using reliable historical records rather than assumptions. Only after this extensive genealogical work do investigators begin identifying individuals who could plausibly be associated with the evidence. Even then, genealogy alone does not establish criminal responsibility. It simply narrows the investigation. Detectives must still gather independent evidence using traditional investigative methods. Surveillance may be conducted where legally appropriate, documentary records reviewed, and ultimately a direct DNA comparison obtained before any arrest is considered. One of the earliest and most widely publicized demonstrations of investigative genetic genealogy occurred in 2018 when California authorities identified the individual responsible for a series of murders and sexual assaults committed decades earlier. That investigation demonstrated that genealogy could generate viable leads even when conventional forensic database searches had failed. Following that announcement, law enforcement agencies throughout the United States began evaluating whether similar methods might assist in resolving other long unsolved violent crimes. The April Tinsley investigation became one of the cases benefiting from this emerging approach. Investigators possessed well-preserved biological evidence collected in 1988, but repeated searches of traditional forensic DNA databases had not identified the offender. As investigative genetic genealogy matured into a practical investigative technique, detectives consulted forensic specialists to determine whether the preserved DNA profile could be analyzed using genealogical methods. The answer was yes. The genealogy process did not immediately reveal the identity of the offender. Instead, it produced biological relationships requiring careful interpretation by trained genealogists. Through extensive research into publicly available records, investigators gradually reconstructed family connections that ultimately narrowed the field of possible individuals. This work required both scientific expertise and traditional historical research. Every conclusion had to be supported by documented relationships rather than speculation. Once investigators identified an individual whose documented family relationships, age, and geographic history were consistent with the genealogical findings, the investigation returned to conventional police work. Detectives obtained a lawfully discarded DNA sample and submitted it for forensic comparison against the crime scene evidence. Laboratory analysis confirmed that the DNA matched the biological evidence preserved from the original investigation. Only after this independent forensic confirmation did investigators proceed with an arrest. The success of cases such as April Tinsley's demonstrated that investigative genetic genealogy should be understood as an investigative lead generation technique rather than a replacement for established forensic procedures. Genealogy points investigators toward possible individuals, but criminal charges continue to depend upon independently admissible evidence meeting established legal standards. This distinction has remained central to professional guidance issued by forensic organizations and law enforcement agencies. The rapid adoption of investigative genetic genealogy also prompted important discussions regarding ethics, privacy, and public policy. Because genealogical databases originated primarily for personal and family history purposes rather than criminal investigations, questions emerged concerning appropriate law enforcement access, user consent, transparency, and legal oversight. Some genealogy companies revised their policies to require users to affirmatively opt in before permitting law enforcement comparisons, while others limited or prohibited such access altogether. Professional organizations developed best practice guidelines emphasizing that the technique should generally be reserved for serious violent crimes and unidentified human remains investigations. Legal scholars have similarly examined how investigative genetic genealogy fits within existing constitutional principles and privacy protections. Although the legal landscape continues to evolve, investigators using the technique generally operate within established judicial procedures and agency policies designed to ensure that genealogical leads are corroborated through traditional investigative methods before enforcement action occurs. Cortez evaluating evidence in criminal prosecutions continue to focus on the admissibility of the independently confirmed forensic evidence rather than the genealogical research that generated the investigative lead. Today, investigative genetic genealogy occupies an increasingly important place within modern forensic science. Hundreds of cold cases involving homicide, sexual assault, and unidentified human remains have benefited from the technique. At the same time, forensic professionals continue refining scientific standards, laboratory procedures, quality assurance measures, and ethical guidelines governing its use. The field remains dynamic, shaped by ongoing technological innovation, legal developments, and public discussion. The evolution of investigative genetic genealogy illustrates a broader principle within forensic science. Advances rarely replace traditional investigative methods. Instead, they expand the range of questions investigators can ask of evidence that has existed for years or even decades. The April Tinsley investigation exemplifies this progression. The biological evidence collected in 1988 never changed. What changed was science's ability to interpret it. Through the combined efforts of forensic scientists, genealogists, detectives, and prosecutors, evidence preserved for more than 30 years ultimately provided the information necessary to identify the individual responsible. That achievement reflects not only technological innovation, but also decades of careful evidence preservation, disciplined investigative work, and continued commitment to pursuing justice whenever new scientific opportunities emerge. The successful resolution of the April Tinsley investigation did not result from a single discovery or one decisive investigative step. Instead, it reflected the cumulative work of numerous detectives, forensic scientists, crime scene specialists, prosecutors, and support personnel over more than 3 decades. Each generation of investigators inherited the work of those who came before, preserving the integrity of the investigation while adapting to advances in forensic science and investigative techniques. The case illustrates how complex homicide investigations are often built incrementally, with every documented fact contributing to a larger evidentiary framework. The investigation began immediately after April Tinsley was reported missing on April 1, still 1988. Detectives first approached the case as a missing child investigation, gathering information about her last known movements, interviewing family members and friends, and identifying the route she had planned to travel that afternoon. Once April's body was discovered the following day in rural DeKalb County, the focus shifted to a homicide investigation. Crime scene investigators documented the recovery location, collected physical evidence, photographed the scene, and preserved biological material that would later become central to the investigation. One of the earliest priorities for detectives was reconstructing April's final known timeline. Investigators established when she had last been seen, identified witnesses who observed her walking through the neighborhood, and determined the approximate period during which the abduction likely occurred. Establishing this timeline helped investigators narrow the window of opportunity during which the offender acted and identify individuals who may have been present in the area. At the same time, detectives conducted extensive neighborhood canvasses. Officers visited homes and businesses, speaking with residents who might have seen unfamiliar vehicles, suspicious activity, or individuals matching descriptions provided by witnesses. Every reported observation was documented, regardless of how insignificant it initially appeared. In major investigations, detectives understand that seemingly unrelated information may later become meaningful when combined with additional evidence. Investigators also evaluated individuals who came to their attention through tips, interviews, or prior criminal records. Each person of interest required systematic examination. Detectives verified alibis where possible, compared witness statements against known facts, and sought corroborating evidence before excluding individuals from further consideration. This process often eliminated numerous potential suspects while strengthening confidence in the integrity of the investigation. Physical evidence remained a central component throughout the case. Crime laboratories examined biological evidence, trace materials, and other items collected during the investigation using the best forensic techniques available at the time. Although DNA technology was still developing in 1988, investigators recognized the potential future value of preserving biological evidence. Laboratory personnel therefore maintained careful chain of custody documentation and preserved remaining samples whenever testing methods required consuming only part of the available evidence. As years passed, the investigation accumulated thousands of pages of documentation. Detectives maintained interview summaries, investigative reports, laboratory findings, photographs, maps, correspondence, and evidence inventories. This comprehensive record-keeping allowed later investigators to understand not only what had been discovered, but also which investigative avenues had already been explored and why certain conclusions had been reached. Such documentation is essential in long-term investigations where personnel inevitably change over time. The handwritten messages discovered in 1990 and 1991 represented another important investigative element. Detectives carefully analyzed the writings, considering whether they demonstrated knowledge of the crime not publicly available. Forensic document examiners reviewed handwriting characteristics, while investigators attempted to identify individuals familiar with the writing style or circumstances surrounding the placement of the messages. Although these efforts did not immediately identify the offender, the materials remained part of the investigative record and continued to be evaluated alongside other evidence. The case periodically underwent formal reviews as new detectives assumed responsibility and forensic capabilities improved. Fresh investigative teams revisited witness statements, reassessed evidence, and considered whether technological advances justified renewed laboratory analysis. These reviews did not assume earlier investigators had made mistakes. Rather, they reflected the understanding that scientific developments could reveal information unavailable when the original investigation occurred. When forensic DNA analysis matured during the 1990s and early 2000s, investigators repeatedly submitted the available biological evidence for comparison against expanding forensic databases. Although these searches did not identify the offender, they confirmed that the preserved evidence remained suitable for continued forensic analysis. Importantly, each unsuccessful database search eliminated one possible investigative avenue while reinforcing the need to preserve the evidence for future technologies. The introduction of investigative genetic genealogy marked a significant turning point, but detectives approached the method cautiously. Genealogical analysis generated potential family relationships rather than identifying a suspect directly. Investigators therefore integrated genealogy with traditional detective work. Public records, census documents, birth certificates, marriage records, and other historical sources were examined to construct verified family trees. Detectives compared these family histories with known facts about the investigation, including geographic location, age, and opportunity. As genealogical research narrowed the field of possible individuals, detectives continued applying conventional investigative methods. They conducted background research, verified publicly available information, and assessed whether any identified individual could reasonably be associated with the evidence. Genealogy alone was never considered sufficient to support criminal charges. The investigation ultimately required direct forensic confirmation. Detectives obtained a DNA sample from an item that had been lawfully discarded in public. Crime laboratory scientists compared that sample with the biological evidence preserved from the 1988 investigation. According to investigators, the laboratory analysis established that the DNA profiles matched. This direct forensic comparison transformed an investigative lead into evidence capable of supporting criminal prosecution. Even after obtaining this result, investigators continued building the evidentiary record. Prosecutors reviewed laboratory reports, chain of custody documentation, investigative procedures, and supporting evidence to ensure that the case satisfied legal standards for prosecution. Detectives prepared detailed reports describing the investigative process from the original crime seen through the modern forensic analysis. Such documentation was essential not only for court proceedings, but also for demonstrating the reliability of the investigation. The eventual guilty plea by John D. Miller meant that the evidence was not subjected to a contested jury trial. Nevertheless, investigators had prepared the case as though every investigative step might require detailed judicial scrutiny. This preparation reflected standard practice in major criminal investigations, where evidence must withstand careful legal examination regardless of whether a trial ultimately occurs. The April Tinsley investigation demonstrates that successful homicide investigations depend upon the integration of multiple disciplines rather than reliance upon any single technique. Crime scene processing, witness interviews, forensic laboratory analysis, investigative documentation, genealogical research, surveillance, legal review, and prosecutorial preparation all contributed to the final outcome. Each stage built upon work completed years earlier, illustrating how careful investigative practices preserve opportunities for future scientific advances. Perhaps the most enduring lesson from the case is that detectives never truly built a new case after 3 decades. They continued building the same case that began in April 1988. Every report written, every item of evidence preserved, every interview documented, and every laboratory examination performed contributed to a continuous investigative record. When new forensic technologies became available, investigators were prepared not because they had discovered entirely new evidence, but because generations of detectives had protected and documented the original evidence with exceptional care. The resulting investigation stands as a comprehensive example of how persistence, scientific innovation, and meticulous police work can combine to resolve a homicide that once appeared beyond the reach of contemporary investigative methods. By the time investigators announced the arrest of John D. Miller in July 2018, the April Tinsley investigation had already become a landmark example of how advances in forensic science could transform a decades-old cold case. Yet identifying a suspect marked only the end of the investigative phase. The next stage belonged to the criminal justice system, where prosecutors were responsible for presenting evidence that satisfied the legal standards required for conviction. Although the public often focuses on the arrest itself, experienced investigators understand that every major case must withstand careful legal scrutiny before accountability can be established in court. Following Miller's arrest, prosecutors formally filed charges related to the abduction, sexual assault, and murder of April Tinsley. As in every criminal case, the filing of charges initiated a series of judicial proceedings governed by constitutional protections and established rules of criminal procedure. Miller was entitled to legal representation, the opportunity to review the evidence presented against him, and all procedural safeguards guaranteed under Indiana and federal law. For prosecutors, one of the strengths of the case was the extensive documentation that investigators had maintained over 3 decades. The original crime scene reports, forensic laboratory records, evidence logs, interview summaries, photographs, chain of custody documentation, and subsequent investigative findings formed a comprehensive record demonstrating how evidence had been collected, preserved, and analyzed. Such documentation is critical in long-term investigations because courts require assurance that physical evidence has remained secure and scientifically reliable from the time it was collected until its presentation in legal proceedings. Among the most significant pieces of evidence was the DNA recovered during the original investigation. Investigators had preserved the biological material using accepted forensic procedures, allowing modern laboratories to conduct additional testing decades later. Prosecutors were prepared to demonstrate not only that the DNA matched Miller, but also how the evidence had been handled continuously since 1988, ensuring that the laboratory findings could be properly admitted under applicable evidentiary standards. The investigative use of genetic genealogy also attracted considerable public attention. Prosecutors and investigators consistently explained that genealogical analysis served only as an investigative lead rather than direct evidence of guilt. The genealogy research helped detectives narrow the investigation toward a potential individual, but the criminal case ultimately relied on independently obtained forensic evidence, specifically the DNA comparison between Miller's lawfully obtained sample and the biological evidence recovered from the crime scene. This distinction remained important because it underscored that the prosecution rested on established forensic evidence rather than genealogical research itself. As pretrial proceedings continued, prosecutors disclosed evidence in accordance with legal requirements, while defense counsel reviewed the investigative record. The judicial process provided opportunities to address evidentiary matters, procedural issues, and scheduling prior to any potential trial. These proceedings reflected the criminal justice system's responsibility to ensure that prosecutions proceed fairly, regardless of the seriousness of the alleged offense or the length of time that has passed since the crime occurred. Rather than proceeding to a full jury trial, the case ultimately concluded through a guilty plea. Miller admitted responsibility for the crimes charged, eliminating the need for prosecutors to present the complete evidentiary record before a jury. Guilty pleas are a recognized component of the American criminal justice system and may occur for various legal and strategic reasons. In this case, the plea brought the criminal proceedings to a conclusion without requiring witnesses, investigators, forensic scientists, or April's family to testify during what would likely have been a lengthy and emotionally difficult trial. Following the guilty plea, the court imposed a sentence of 80 years imprisonment. The sentence reflected the seriousness of the offenses and formally concluded the criminal prosecution. With the entry of judgment, one of Indiana's longest-running homicide investigations reached its legal resolution more than 30 years after April Tinsley's death. The conclusion of the criminal proceedings also marked an important moment for the investigators who had worked on the case across multiple decades. Many of the detectives involved in the original investigation had retired long before the arrest occurred. Others inherited responsibility for the case years later, building upon the work of their predecessors while incorporating advances in forensic science. Public statements made after the guilty plea frequently emphasized that the successful prosecution reflected the combined efforts of numerous investigators, laboratory personnel, prosecutors, and support staff rather than the work of any single individual. For April's family, the guilty plea ended decades of uncertainty regarding the identity of the offender. Publicly available statements following the court proceedings expressed appreciation for the persistence demonstrated by investigators and acknowledged the role that scientific advances had played in identifying the person responsible. Although no criminal sentence could undo the events of 1988, the judicial process established legal accountability through a conviction supported by forensic evidence. The April Tinsley prosecution also became an important reference point within the legal and forensic communities. Prosecutors examining other cold cases studied the investigation as an example of how biological evidence preserved for decades could be effectively presented in court after undergoing modern forensic analysis. The case demonstrated that the passage of time does not necessarily diminish the evidentiary value of properly preserved forensic material, provided that investigators maintain complete documentation and laboratories follow accepted scientific procedures. From a legal perspective, the case further illustrated the distinction between investigative techniques and courtroom evidence. Genetic genealogy helped generate an investigative lead, but prosecutors relied upon conventional forensic DNA evidence, documentary records, witness testimony where appropriate, and properly authenticated investigative documentation to establish the factual basis supporting the conviction. This approach reinforced the principle that emerging investigative technologies must ultimately be supported by evidence admissible under established legal standards. The prosecution also highlighted the importance of interdisciplinary cooperation within the criminal justice system. Detectives, forensic scientists, genealogists, laboratory analysts, prosecutors, victim advocates, and court personnel each performed specialized roles contributing to the successful resolution of the case. Their coordinated efforts demonstrated how complex criminal investigations increasingly require expertise across multiple disciplines while remaining grounded in established investigative and legal principles. Today, The court proceedings in the April Tinsley case are frequently discussed alongside the investigation itself because they illustrate the final stage of a successful cold case prosecution. Solving a crime involves more than identifying a suspect. It also requires assembling reliable evidence, preserving its integrity over time, complying with constitutional safeguards, and presenting the case within the judicial system according to established legal standards. The April Tinsley prosecution demonstrates how decades of careful investigative work, combined with responsible application of modern forensic science, ultimately resulted in a legally supported conviction that brought one of Indiana's most significant cold case investigations to its conclusion. The successful resolution of the April Tinsley investigation depended on many factors, but one principle stands above the rest: the careful preservation of evidence. When investigators first responded to the crime in April 1988, they had no way of knowing how forensic science would evolve over the following 3 decades. DNA profiling was only beginning to emerge as a practical investigative tool, and many of the technologies routinely used by forensic laboratories today had not yet been developed. Nevertheless, detectives and crime scene personnel treated every recoverable piece of physical evidence as potentially important, preserving materials according to accepted forensic procedures and maintaining detailed records of their collection and storage. Those decisions proved essential decades later. Crime scene preservation begins long before laboratory analysis. Investigators first establish control of the scene, document its condition through notes and photography, identify potential sources of evidence, and carefully collect items using procedures designed to minimize contamination. Every item receives identifying information describing where it was recovered, who collected it, and when it entered official custody. These records form the beginning of what is known as the chain of custody, a documented history demonstrating continuous accountability for every piece of evidence from the moment of collection until its presentation in court. In the April Tinsley investigation, maintaining that chain of custody became particularly important because more than 30 years passed between the crime and the eventual prosecution. Throughout those decades, the biological evidence remained securely stored, and every transfer between investigators, laboratories, or evidence facilities was documented. Such procedures are not unique to this case. They represent standard forensic practice intended to preserve both the physical integrity and legal admissibility of evidence. Biological evidence requires especially careful handling. Samples containing DNA can deteriorate if exposed to unsuitable environmental conditions or become contaminated if handled improperly. Forensic laboratories therefore follow strict protocols governing storage, packaging, transportation, and laboratory analysis. Advances in forensic science have made it possible to obtain increasingly detailed DNA profiles from smaller or older samples than earlier technologies could analyze. However, those scientific advances are useful only when the original evidence has been properly preserved. The April Tinsley investigation illustrates this principle clearly. Detectives in 1988 preserved biological material using the best available methods of their time. Although laboratory capabilities were limited compared with modern standards, investigators recognized that future scientific developments might allow additional testing. Rather than consuming all available material during early examinations, forensic specialists preserved remaining samples whenever possible. This cautious approach ensured that evidence remained available for later analysis as technology improved. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, investigators periodically submitted preserved evidence for additional laboratory examination. Each new generation of forensic testing offered opportunities to extract more information than previous methods had allowed. Importantly, these examinations did not replace earlier work. Instead, they built upon it. Laboratory scientists carefully documented every analytical procedure, preserving both the evidence itself and the scientific record explaining how conclusions had been reached. Evidence preservation extended beyond biological material. Investigators maintained photographs, crime scene diagrams, interview records, laboratory reports, correspondence, and other investigative documents. Together, these records formed a comprehensive historical archive of the investigation. When new detectives assumed responsibility for the case years later, they were able to review the original investigative decisions, understand prior conclusions, and identify opportunities for renewed analysis based on developments in forensic science. Cold case investigations frequently demonstrate the importance of such documentation. Detectives assigned years after the original investigation cannot rely solely on memory or informal accounts. Instead, they depend upon detailed records prepared by earlier investigators. Every interview summary, evidence inventory, and laboratory report contributes to a complete understanding of the investigation. The April Tinsley case benefited from decades of disciplined record-keeping that preserved institutional knowledge despite changes in investigative personnel. The emergence of investigative genetic genealogy further demonstrated why preserving biological evidence mattered. Although genealogical analysis represented a significant scientific development, it required a high-quality DNA profile generated from preserved crime scene evidence. Without that original biological material, genealogical methods could not have been applied. Thus, the technological breakthrough achieved decades later depended entirely upon evidence collected and safeguarded during the original investigation. The case also illustrates an important principle regarding forensic science. Evidence itself rarely changes. What changes is the ability of scientists to analyze it. The biological material recovered in 1988 contained the same genetic information throughout the investigation. Advances in laboratory techniques simply enabled forensic scientists to interpret that information with greater precision than earlier generations of technology permitted. Because investigators had preserved the evidence rather than exhausting or discarding it, each scientific advancement created new opportunities for analysis. Professional forensic organizations frequently cite cases like April Tinsley's when emphasizing the importance of evidence retention policies. Many jurisdictions now maintain long-term storage procedures for biological evidence recovered in major violent crimes, recognizing that future technological developments may produce results impossible to obtain today. The case has therefore contributed to broader discussions concerning evidence management, laboratory quality assurance, and long-term investigative planning. The investigation also demonstrates the relationship between evidence preservation and public confidence in the criminal justice system. Successful prosecution requires more than identifying a suspect. Cortez must be satisfied that forensic evidence has remained reliable from collection through analysis and presentation. Detailed chain of custody records, laboratory documentation, and established forensic procedures provide the transparency necessary to evaluate scientific findings objectively. In the April Tinsley prosecution, decades of careful evidence management supported the reliability of the forensic conclusions presented by investigators. Law enforcement agencies have incorporated lessons from long-term investigations into training programs for detectives, crime scene personnel, and evidence technicians. New investigators are routinely instructed that even evidence appearing insignificant at the time of collection may become critically important as forensic science evolves. Consequently, careful preservation is viewed not merely as an administrative responsibility, but as a fundamental investigative practice with potential consequences extending decades into the future. The April Tinsley investigation remains an important example because it demonstrates that solving a cold case often depends less upon discovering new evidence than upon preserving existing evidence until science can fully interpret it. Every investigator who handled the evidence, every laboratory scientist who documented analytical procedures, and every evidence custodian who maintained secure storage contributed to the eventual resolution of the case. Their work illustrates that forensic success is rarely the product of a single breakthrough. Instead, it reflects years of disciplined professional practice carried out according to established scientific and legal standards. Ultimately, the preservation of evidence ensured that when investigative genetic genealogy and advanced DNA analysis became available, the case was ready. The biological evidence collected in 1988 remained scientifically viable, legally admissible, and capable of supporting further examination. That continuity transformed a decades-old investigation into one that could benefit from entirely new forensic technologies, demonstrating that careful evidence preservation is not simply about protecting the past, it is about preserving future opportunities for justice. The resolution of the April Tinsley investigation extended far beyond the conclusion of a single homicide case. Within the law enforcement and forensic science communities, The case quickly became an important example of how technological advances, combined with decades of careful investigative work, could fundamentally change the prospects for solving violent crimes that had remained unresolved for many years. Although every investigation presents unique challenges, the April Tinsley case demonstrated principles that have influenced cold case practices across the United States. For many years, investigators understood that biological evidence from numerous cold cases existed, but could not identify offenders through conventional DNA database searches. The limitation was not the quality of the evidence itself. Rather, it was the absence of a matching reference profile in established forensic databases. The successful application of investigative genetic genealogy in the April Tinsley investigation illustrated a new investigative pathway for carefully selected cases where traditional methods had reached their limits. Law enforcement agencies responded by reviewing other unsolved investigations involving preserved biological evidence. Detectives and forensic specialists evaluated whether advances in DNA technology or genealogical analysis might provide new opportunities to generate investigative leads. Many agencies established formal review procedures to identify cases that met the scientific and legal requirements for additional forensic examination. These reviews reflected a broader recognition that unresolved cases should be periodically reassessed as investigative technologies continue to evolve. The April Tinsley investigation also reinforced the importance of multidisciplinary cooperation. Modern cold case investigations increasingly require expertise extending beyond traditional detective work. Crime scene specialists, forensic laboratory scientists, investigative genealogists, prosecutors, digital analysts, victim advocates, and evidence custodians all contribute specialized knowledge that supports the investigative process. The successful coordination of these disciplines became one of the defining characteristics of the investigation. Professional law enforcement organizations incorporated lessons from the case into training and educational programs. Detectives studying cold case methodology examined how investigators balance conventional police work with emerging scientific techniques. Training emphasized that investigative genetic genealogy did not replace witness interviews, documentary research, surveillance, or forensic laboratory analysis. Instead, genealogy functioned as an investigative-led generation tool that required confirmation through independently admissible evidence before any criminal charges could be pursued. Evidence preservation became another central lesson. The biological evidence collected in 1988 remained scientifically valuable because investigators had followed accepted procedures for collection, storage, and documentation. This outcome encouraged agencies to review evidence retention policies governing unsolved violent crimes. Many departments reaffirmed the importance of preserving biological evidence indefinitely whenever legally and practically feasible, recognizing that future scientific developments may produce analytical capabilities unavailable at the time evidence is originally collected. The case further demonstrated the importance of maintaining comprehensive investigative records. Over more than 30 years, multiple generations of detectives assumed responsibility for the investigation. Detailed reports, interview summaries, laboratory findings, photographs, evidence inventories, and chain of custody documentation allowed each new investigative team to understand prior work without repeating completed investigative steps unnecessarily. Thorough documentation ensured continuity despite inevitable changes in personnel over time. Another significant contribution involved public understanding of cold case investigations. The April Tinsley case illustrated that unresolved investigations are not necessarily inactive investigations. Detectives frequently continue reviewing evidence, monitoring scientific developments, and evaluating new information even when no public announcements occur for extended periods. The eventual resolution of the case demonstrated that the absence of visible investigative activity does not necessarily indicate that a case has been abandoned. The investigation also contributed to broader discussions regarding resource allocation within law enforcement agencies. Maintaining cold case units, preserving evidence, conducting periodic forensic reviews, and pursuing advanced laboratory analysis require substantial institutional commitment. Cases such as April Tinsley's provided practical examples supporting continued investment in long-term investigative capabilities. Many agencies recognized that successful cold case investigations often depend upon sustained organizational support extending across decades. Within forensic science, the case encouraged continued refinement of laboratory techniques capable of analyzing smaller, older, or more degraded biological samples. Scientists continued improving methods for DNA extraction, amplification, sequencing, and quality assurance. Although these technological advances occur independently of individual investigations, successful applications in major cases help demonstrate their practical value and encourage broader implementation where scientifically appropriate. The legal community likewise examined the investigation as part of ongoing discussions concerning emerging forensic technologies. Prosecutors and defense attorneys considered how investigative genetic genealogy should be integrated into existing evidentiary frameworks. Cortez, policymakers, and professional organizations continued evaluating best practices governing the use of genealogical information while maintaining established legal protections and procedural safeguards. These discussions contributed to the development of policies emphasizing transparency, scientific reliability, and appropriate judicial oversight. Victim advocacy organizations also cited the April Tinsley investigation when discussing the importance of sustained communication with families affected by unresolved violent crimes. Long-term investigations often span decades, during which families experience repeated anniversaries, periodic investigative developments, and evolving public attention. Maintaining professional communication while respecting investigative confidentiality remains an important component of effective cold case management. Internationally, investigators in other countries observe developments in forensic genealogy with growing interest. Although legal frameworks differ across jurisdictions, the scientific principles demonstrated in the April Tinsley investigation contributed to broader discussions regarding the future role of advanced DNA analysis in unresolved criminal investigations. Researchers, forensic laboratories, and law enforcement agencies continue exchanging information through professional conferences, scientific publications, and collaborative research addressing the responsible application of these methods. Despite the attention received by investigative genetic genealogy, experienced investigators consistently emphasize that no single technology solves cases independently. The April Tinsley investigation succeeded because multiple components functioned together: careful crime scene processing, evidence preservation, detailed investigative documentation, periodic case review, advances in forensic science, genealogical research, traditional detective work, laboratory confirmation, prosecutorial preparation, and judicial proceedings. Removing any one of these elements could have significantly affected the investigation's outcome. Today, the April Tinsley case is frequently referenced in criminal justice education as an example of how persistence, scientific innovation, and institutional continuity can converge to resolve a long unsolved homicide. It demonstrates that technological advances achieve their greatest value when supported by disciplined investigative practices established years or even decades earlier. Rather than representing a dramatic departure from traditional policing, the investigation illustrates how emerging forensic methods complement long-standing investigative principles. The broader legacy of the case continues to influence discussions about the future of cold case investigations. As forensic science advances further, investigators recognize that evidence preserved today may yield new information using technologies that do not yet exist. The April Tinsley investigation, therefore, serves not only as a historical case study, but also as a reminder that every carefully documented investigation preserves opportunities for future scientific discovery. Its lasting contribution lies in demonstrating that the combination of professional persistence, responsible innovation, and meticulous evidence preservation can transform investigations once considered beyond resolution into cases capable of achieving accountability through the criminal justice system. The successful resolution of the April Tinsley investigation brought renewed attention not only to the capabilities of forensic science, but also to the legal and ethical questions surrounding investigative genetic genealogy. While many viewed the case as evidence of the remarkable progress made in solving long unsolved violent crimes, Others emphasize the importance of ensuring that emerging investigative methods develop within clear legal frameworks, transparent policies, and appropriate safeguards. As investigative genetic genealogy became more widely used, discussions expanded beyond individual cases to broader questions concerning privacy, consent, scientific reliability, and public confidence in the criminal justice system. One of the most significant distinctions emphasized by investigators is the difference between forensic DNA databases and genealogical DNA databases. Traditional forensic databases, such as the Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, in the United States, operate under statutory and regulatory frameworks that define whose DNA may be included and how the information may be used. These databases generally contain DNA profiles collected through the criminal justice system under applicable laws and are designed specifically for forensic identification. Genealogical databases developed for an entirely different purpose. Many were created to help individuals explore family history, identify biological relatives, or learn about ancestral origins. Participation is generally voluntary, and users choose whether to submit their DNA for genealogical analysis. As law enforcement agencies began exploring whether these databases could assist in identifying unknown offenders, important questions emerged concerning user expectations, informed consent, and the circumstances under which genealogical information should be made available for criminal investigations. In response to these questions, several genealogy service providers modified their policies regarding law enforcement access. Some introduced opt-in systems, allowing users to decide whether their DNA information could be compared in criminal investigations involving serious violent crimes or unidentified human remains. Others adopted more restrictive policies or prohibited such searches entirely. These differing approaches reflected the evolving nature of both the technology and public expectations concerning genetic privacy. Professional forensic organizations also developed guidance intended to promote responsible use of investigative genetic genealogy. While specific policies vary among jurisdictions, common principles have emerged. These include limiting the technique to investigations involving serious violent crimes or unidentified human remains, requiring that conventional investigative methods have been exhausted or proved unsuccessful, maintaining appropriate supervisory review, documenting investigative decisions carefully, and obtaining independent forensic confirmation before seeking criminal charges. The April Tinsley investigation illustrates these principles in practice. Publicly available information indicates that investigators first attempted to identify the offender through conventional DNA database comparisons. Only after those efforts failed and new scientific methods became available did they pursue investigative genetic genealogy as an additional investigative technique. Even then, genealogy served only to generate investigative leads. Detectives ultimately relied upon independently obtained DNA evidence to confirm the identity of the individual under investigation before making an arrest. This distinction is legally significant. Genealogical analysis itself is generally not presented as proof of guilt in criminal proceedings. Instead, it functions as an investigative process that directs detectives toward individuals who may warrant further investigation. Cortez continued to evaluate admissible evidence according to established evidentiary standards, focusing on independently verified forensic findings, witness testimony where applicable, documentary evidence, and other materials meeting legal requirements for reliability and admissibility. Legal scholars have also examined constitutional questions associated with investigative genetic genealogy. In the United States, discussions often involve the relationship between the Fourth Amendment, expectations of privacy, and the voluntary sharing of genetic information through genealogy services. Because legal standards continue to evolve alongside technological developments, investigators work closely with prosecutors and legal advisors to ensure that investigative methods remain consistent with current law and judicial guidance. Another ethical consideration involves the potential impact upon individuals who are not themselves subjects of criminal investigations. Genealogical analysis frequently begins by identifying distant biological relatives of an unknown individual. These relatives are not suspects and may have no knowledge of the investigation. Professional genealogists and investigators therefore approach family history research carefully, recognizing the importance of protecting privacy while limiting investigative attention to individuals supported by evidence rather than biological relationship alone. The development of investigative genetic genealogy has also encouraged greater collaboration between scientists, genealogists, legal experts, ethicists, and policymakers. Conferences, academic publications, and professional working groups continue examining best practices governing laboratory procedures, data management, quality assurance, transparency, and oversight. These collaborative efforts aim to establish standards that promote both investigative effectiveness and public confidence. Public confidence remains an important consideration because successful criminal investigations depend not only upon scientific capability, but also upon community trust. Investigators have generally emphasized transparency regarding the role of genealogy in investigations while explaining that traditional forensic confirmation remains essential before criminal prosecution. By distinguishing investigative leads from courtroom evidence, law enforcement agencies seek to ensure that public understanding accurately reflects the scientific and legal processes involved. The April Tinsley investigation also contributed to discussions regarding proportionality. Investigative genetic genealogy requires significant scientific expertise, genealogical research, legal review, and laboratory resources. Consequently, many agencies reserve the technique for investigations involving homicide, sexual assault, or unidentified human remains rather than less serious offenses. This prioritization reflects both resource considerations and the ethical balance between investigative necessity and individual privacy interests. As technology continues advancing, researchers anticipate further developments in forensic genetics, improved sequencing techniques, expanded analytical methods, and enhanced laboratory capabilities may increase investigators' ability to interpret biological evidence while simultaneously raising new legal and ethical questions. Policymakers, courts, and professional organizations will likely continue refining standards governing these technologies as scientific knowledge evolves. Importantly, the April Tinsley investigation demonstrates that responsible innovation depends upon integrating new scientific methods with long-standing legal principles. Investigators did not abandon traditional procedures when genealogy became available. Instead, they incorporated the new technique into an established investigative framework, emphasizing evidence preservation, careful documentation, independent forensic verification, prosecutorial review, and judicial oversight. This balanced approach has become one of the defining lessons associated with the case. Today, investigative genetic genealogy occupies an increasingly recognized place within modern forensic investigation, but its use continues to develop through ongoing scientific research, legal analysis, and public discussion. The April Tinsley investigation remains a significant example because it illustrates both the promise and the responsibilities accompanying emerging forensic technologies. It demonstrates that scientific progress can create powerful new investigative opportunities while reinforcing the enduring importance of transparency, accountability, and adherence to established legal standards. Ultimately, the ethical and legal discussions surrounding investigative genetic genealogy are not separate from the pursuit of justice. They are part of it. Advances in forensic science achieve their greatest value when implemented in ways that respect constitutional protections, maintain scientific integrity, and preserve public confidence in the criminal justice system. The April Tinsley investigation stands as an example of how these objectives can be pursued together, showing that innovation and accountability are most effective when they advance side by side. More than 3 decades separated the day April Tinsley disappeared from the day the criminal justice system finally reached its conclusion. During those years, the investigation passed through different generations of detectives, advances in forensic science transformed investigative capabilities, and public understanding of DNA evidence evolved dramatically. When viewed in its entirety, the case is not simply the story of a single homicide investigation. It is also the story of how careful police work, scientific progress, and institutional persistence combined to resolve a crime that once appeared beyond the reach of contemporary investigative methods. The events of April 1988 profoundly affected the communities of Fort Wayne, Leo, and the surrounding region of northeastern Indiana. Like many crimes involving children, the investigation had an impact extending well beyond those directly connected to the case. Schools, community organizations, law enforcement agencies, and families all responded by strengthening awareness of child safety and encouraging cooperation with investigators. Although public attention naturally changed over time, the memory of the case remained an important part of the region's history. Within law enforcement, the investigation became a long-term commitment rather than a short-term response. Detectives who inherited responsibility for the case did not begin with a blank file. They relied upon the extensive documentation prepared by earlier investigators, including crime scene reports, interview records, forensic laboratory findings, evidence inventories, maps, photographs, and investigative notes. This continuity allowed each successive investigative team to build upon previous work while incorporating new scientific methods as they became available. The preservation of evidence proved to be one of the defining features of the investigation. The biological material collected in 1988 remained available for advanced forensic examination decades later because investigators followed accepted evidence handling procedures from the very beginning. The case has since been widely cited in professional discussions as an example of why evidence from serious violent crimes should be preserved whenever possible. Scientific capabilities continue to evolve, and evidence that appears to have limited value today may become critically important in the future. The investigation also demonstrated that technological innovation is most effective when supported by disciplined investigative practices. Investigative genetic genealogy generated valuable leads, but it did not replace traditional police work. Detectives continued reviewing records, verifying family histories, conducting lawful surveillance, obtaining independently admissible DNA evidence, and preparing comprehensive documentation for prosecutors. Every scientific development was integrated into an investigative process governed by established legal standards rather than treated as a substitute for conventional evidence. Forensic scientists likewise view the case as an important milestone. The successful application of advanced DNA analysis illustrated the practical benefits of decades of research into molecular biology, laboratory procedures, quality assurance, and evidence interpretation. Yet the scientific achievement was not limited to laboratory technology alone. It also reflected collaboration among crime scene specialists, forensic analysts, genealogists, prosecutors, and investigators working toward a common objective while maintaining rigorous professional standards. The legal proceedings that followed the investigation reinforced another important principle. Identifying a suspect is only one stage of the criminal justice process. Prosecutors must present evidence capable of satisfying legal requirements, while courts ensure that constitutional protections and procedural safeguards are respected. The guilty plea entered by John D. Miller concluded the prosecution without a contested trial, but investigators had prepared the case as though every aspect of the evidence might require judicial examination. Their careful preparation reflected the professional expectation that scientific findings must always withstand legal scrutiny. The broader influence of the case extends into criminal justice education. Police academies, detective training programs, forensic science courses, and legal education seminars frequently examine investigations such as April Tinsley's to illustrate the relationship between evidence preservation, technological advancement, investigative persistence, and interdisciplinary cooperation. Students studying modern criminal investigations encounter the case not simply because it was solved, but because of the methods that made its resolution possible. The investigation has also contributed to continued discussion regarding the responsible use of investigative genetic genealogy. Since the case was resolved, forensic organizations, policymakers, legal scholars, and genealogy service providers have continued refining guidance governing the use of genetic genealogy in criminal investigations. These discussions recognize that scientific innovation must remain consistent with legal protections, ethical responsibilities, and public confidence in the criminal justice system. The April Tinsley investigation remains part of those discussions because it demonstrates both the opportunities created by new technologies and the importance of applying them responsibly. Another enduring lesson concerns patience. Popular portrayals of criminal investigations often emphasize dramatic breakthroughs occurring within days or weeks. The April Tinsley investigation presents a different reality. Progress occurred gradually over many years through careful documentation, repeated forensic reviews, continued evidence preservation, and sustained institutional commitment. Each generation of investigators contributed incremental progress without knowing whether the case would ultimately be solved. Their work illustrates that persistence itself can become one of the most valuable investigative resources. The case further reminds investigators that the passage of time does not necessarily diminish the possibility of resolution. Advances in forensic science continue expanding the range of questions that can be asked of preserved evidence. Investigators today recognize that unresolved cases should not be viewed solely through the limitations of the technology available when the crime occurred. Instead, they are periodically reassessed in light of new scientific capabilities, improved laboratory methods, and evolving investigative techniques. For April Tinsley's family, the conclusion of the criminal case represented the end of a legal process that had extended for more than 30 years. Public statements made following the investigation reflected appreciation for the persistence demonstrated by investigators and acknowledged the role of scientific advancement in identifying the offender. While no criminal proceeding can undo the events of 1988, the judicial outcome established legal accountability and concluded one of Indiana's most significant cold case investigations. Today, the April Tinsley investigation remains an important reference point for professionals engaged in homicide investigation, forensic science, criminal law, and victim advocacy. Its significance lies not only in the successful identification and prosecution of the offender, but also in the investigative principles it illustrates. Preserve evidence carefully, document every investigative step thoroughly, remain open to scientific innovation, and continue evaluating unresolved cases as new technologies emerge. These lessons extend beyond any single investigation and continue influencing how agencies approach cold cases across the United States. Ultimately, the legacy of the April Tinsley investigation is measured not by the passage of time, but by the enduring value of professional perseverance. The evidence collected in 1988 never changed. What changed was the ability of science to interpret it. The investigators who preserved that evidence could not foresee the technologies that would eventually become available, yet they recognized that future advancements might one day provide answers unavailable to them. Their foresight, combined with decades of careful investigative work and responsible scientific innovation, transformed a long unsolved homicide into a documented example of how justice can still be pursued even after many years have passed. The April Tinsley investigation, therefore, stands as more than the resolution of a single criminal case. It represents the continuing evolution of forensic science, the importance of meticulous investigative practice, and the commitment of law enforcement professionals who refuse to regard the passage of time as the end of an investigation. Instead, it demonstrates that every carefully preserved piece of evidence carries the possibility that future knowledge may reveal what once seemed impossible to discover, a principle that continues to shape cold case investigations throughout the criminal justice system today.